At this time, the court calls State of Wisconsin versus Stephen Avery, case number 05-CF381. We are here for a continuation of the trial in this matter this morning. Will the parties state their appearances for the record, please?
Good morning, Judge. The State of Wisconsin appears by Calumet County District Attorney Ken Kratz, Assistant Attorney General Tom Fallon, Assistant District Attorney Norm Kahn, all appearing as special prosecutors.
Good morning. Stephen Avery is here in person. Jerome Buting represents him. Dean Strang appears on his behalf as well.
Is there anything else this morning before we resume the defense cross-examination of Mrs. Eisenberg?
I just wanted to alert the court that Mr. Strang and I are working out the final language of a stipulation that we would like to put it on the record after Dr. Eisenberg completes her testimony. We're waiting for the completion of her testimony to finalize the language regarding a stipulation to save us a witness.
Very well. The coordinator may bring the witness in, and will bring the jury in. You may be seated. Good morning, members of the jury. When we left off yesterday afternoon, the defence was conducting its cross-examination of Dr. Eisenberg. We'll resume this morning. Mr. Strang, you may continue.
You want the witness to be sworn?
I think we will. We've been doing that. We'll have the clerk swear the witness.
Please be seated.
Welcome back. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Yesterday, when we broke off, we were talking about a site somewhat southwest of, what we have all here been calling the Avery salvage yard property. I want to just go back, though, a little bit to get us up there again. And now, when I say go back a little bit, I'm going to go back to the Yander burn barrel, number 2, just for a little bit, okay?
Yes, sir.
Which was your tag, not your tag, but tag number 7964.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, again, nowhere did you find evidence that you were looking at bone fragments from more than one body.
That is correct.
The bone fragments you saw under tag number 7964 from the burn barrel were burned, charred, some of them calcined, as they had been in the burn area.
The human bone?
Yes, the human bone, because you did find some non-human bone.
In the location?
In the burn area and in the burn barrel.
That's correct.
Some of them were what you called avian bone.
Avian simply is a Latin term for, means bird bone.
A bird, right. So whether it's a chicken or a turkey or a pheasant, some sort of something with wings.
Yes.
All right. So you correct me if I forget to add the human, because it's ordinarily human bone I mean to be talking with you about.
Understood.
Okay. Now, one of the things we didn't cover, and I want to cover with respect to the burn barrel, is when you are looking at these human bone fragments, you are using not just your eyes, of course, but you are also using your sense of smell. Is that right? Is that fair?
That's fair.
Smelling. Do I smell the odour of, let's say, fuel, some accelerant or something, correct?
Yes.
The only human bone fragments on which you detected an odour of some sort of accelerant or flammable liquid were the bone fragments that came out of the Yander burn barrel. Is that accurate?
No, I would qualify that by saying that the container in which those fragments from 7964 associated with burn barrel number 2 behind the Yander residence, upon opening the container, there wasn't an odour of fuel. Whether or not they were specifically human bone, I could not say.
Very good. Thank you. Because I was not clear on your report, but that makes sense. So you opened this Tupperware type container, or was this a plastic bag, some container?
A sealed, lidded container.
Plastic lidded container.
Yes.
And it's there that you get the waft of some kind of flammable liquid or fluid?
Yes.
But of course, there is no way to tell which of the bone fragments or non-bone material that may be coming from.
Right. There was no way to tell from the contents of that container where that odour was coming from.
All right, very well. Now, you did not detect the distinctive smell of burnt rubber from any of the containers you examined here that contained human bone fragments?
I did not.
And by that, I mean any of the containers, all of the tag numbers from whatever source.
I did not.
Neither did you. Did you note any residue from, let's say, burnt rubber that was visible to you in any of the containers you examined?
No burned rubber. That's correct.
Now, if we're warmed up, I think let's go now. Back to tag number 8675, where we left off yesterday afternoon. And this is to get ourselves oriented again. I want to go to the Elmo.
It may not be turned on.
Okay, this is just 402 again, which we saw yesterday. Tag 8675. Are the items that came to you reportedly from the GPS coordinates of that red flag?
That's correct.
Somewhere southwest of the Avery property.
Yes.
Have you ever seen a photograph of the Avery property from the air?
I believe I have seen one.
All right. You may or may not be able to work with Exhibit 91, but I will show it to you. Can you orient yourself from that photograph? This is an exhibit that's been admitted. I'm sorry, I should have shown it to you. It's Exhibit 91.
Yes, I can.
Okay. You can see where the Avery salvage property is?
Yes, I can.
All right. Does it look to you like we're looking east from an airplane?
It does, because the Avery and Yonder properties appear at the lower left-hand corner of the salvage yard.
Terrific, thank you. Let me pop this up on the Elmo. Okay, so obviously someone taking this photograph is up in an airplane, and what we're doing is we're flying probably about close to due east here.
I'm sorry, close to?
To due east.
Due east, yes.
Toward the lake, and the road coming through at an angle on the upper left corner of the picture is Highway 147.
I believe it is.
And we can see Avery Road coming down to the northeast corner of the salvage yard.
That's correct.
Okay, and we can't place the location from which the material under tag number 8675 came, but we can see here that there's essentially quarry area and some wooded areas to the south of the Avery property.
Yes, that's correct.
So I'm going to refer to tag 8675 as a quarry pile. Does that work?
It does. Understood.
All right. Now, you found in the material from the quarry pile 2 fragments that appear to you, in your experience, to be pelvic bone. Is that right?
That's correct.
There were some cuts. Appeared to be some cuts on those pelvic bone fragments?
Yes.
But you weren't able to conclude 100% certain that these were human pelvic bone fragments. Do I understand that correctly?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, you suspected them of being human pelvic bone. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes.
You still suspect them of being human pelvic bone?
Suspected, possible, human.
Right. And part of the problem you had in identifying those as certainly human is that they were so small.
It was less their size than what the contours of the bone looked like after they were cut, but it was clearly a joint articulation at the right side of the pelvis, where the pelvis meets the lower part of the spine.
You say the right side. You actually were able to say which side of the pelvis.
Yes.
Okay. And the overall thickness of those fragments was consistent with a human being.
Objection. She indicated suspected and possible, and that's as far as she can go. I don't believe there's any testimony regarding consistent or non-consistent. She couldn't identify.
I think his question is just asking about one element of the bones, not concluding that it was a human bone. So as I understand the question, I'm going to allow it.
The thickness, and actually, it's a fair point. Let me just drop back and ask you a foundational question or two before I get to that. One of the things that distinguishes human bones from even large animal bones is the wall thickness of the bone. Am I correct in that?
You are partially correct. It's the relationship or the ratio of the thickness of the outside of the bone to the size of what we would call the marrow cavity, the inside of the bone.
Okay, so if we have a round bone, there's a wall thickness, so to speak, and then a marrow cavity. You are describing that as inside.
A space, like a cylinder.
Right. And then the other wall.
Correct.
And if we were looking at something like a deer, a relatively large animal, would we find in a long bone of a deer that the wall thickness of the bone was less than the wall thickness of a similarly long human bone?
No. The thickness, the diameter, the measurement of the outside of the bone in humans would be less than that in a deer bone, for example.
Now, I think I lost you. I mean, you are talking about the ratio of the wall thickness to the thickness of the marrow cavity.
Oh, that's correct.
And it's a thicker wall relative to the marrow cavity in a human bone.
No, it's a thinner wall.
I have it the other way round.
Yes.
Okay, all right. So the question then, is the thickness of the bone wall here that you observed on these two pelvic bone fragments, was that thickness at least consistent with human pelvic bone?
Let me answer your question in two parts. The first part is that the architecture or the makeup of these pelvic bone cut fragments is different in character and shape than the long bones you have been talking about. The internal structure of these bones is made up almost entirely of honeycomb-looking bone.
All right.
And so, using the long bone as an example may not be an accurate comparison. Secondly, the thinness of the outside bone of these pelvic cut fragments is not inconsistent with the thickness I would expect to see relative to the honeycomb in humans.
Okay. And it is not inconsistent with the human
Correct.
bone. And let me ask you just maybe the simplest, most straightforward question here. Is what you made suspect that these pieces of pelvic bone could be human?
The contours of the bone, and more particularly the shape of what we call the articular surfaces, where one bone fits with another bone at the hip joint.
Those appeared consistent with a human being.
With the shape and the contours of what will be expected in a human bone.
All right.
Yeah.
Now, I would like to show you something that's not been marked as an exhibit, and I don't have a small copy of it, so I'm going to pause and tell Mr. Fallon what it is that I want to put up on the screen. If you would bear with me, I will let you in on the secret now. I'm going to show you what's marked on the CD-ROM that I got from the report that you and Trooper Austin did.
Yes.
What's marked as Skeleton 1. It's a JPEG file. Skeleton 1, okay?
Yes.
And that's what you are about to see. Now you know, this is again one of these computer-generated models that Trooper Austin did under your supervision.
He was not working under my supervision, but we worked cooperatively to depict my findings.
He was good with the computers, you were good with human skeletons.
Hopefully, yes.
Yes. And again, this isn't a photograph, but what you know in looking at this model is that the features you see are consistent. with an adult female human skeleton.
Without seeing this side by side with what might be a male skeleton, I will agree to that characterization.
Okay, and look, I'm not trying to push you somewhere you don't want to go on this. This is from your report.
Yes.
Do you need to look at your report or reorient yourself to what skeleton figure I was?
This is from Trooper Austin's report.
Yeah, I mean the report the two of you put together.
That's fine. I don't believe that's necessary.
Okay, so you are comfortable, and I don't know, frankly, that female versus male makes a big difference on this point, but show us the pelvis.
May I approach?
We'll give you a laser point, or you can approach if you like, but
Thank you.
sure.
As I mentioned yesterday, the pelvic girdle, or the pelvis, that we all probably think about as one bone is actually 3 different bones.
All right. You talked about the fragments you saw under tag 8675 being right pelvic bone, so let's identify that.
Okay, I should clarify. One of those, for one of those fragments, it's impossible to side the iliac crest that we talked about yesterday, but the other 2 fragments that are still articulated at a joint surface are from the right side.
So show me the right pelvic bone here, if you would. And this is obvious, it's left as we're all looking at it. But when you say right or left on a human body, you are talking about as if you were in the person's skin.
And I'm sorry, I should have clarified that. When we look at a graphic or a photograph like this, computer generated image, we, in the same way we were looking at the face yesterday, we are then looking at someone who would be facing us. So the right hand side will be the person's right hand side.
Correct, yes.
And we're facing, as we're facing, correct.
My right pelvic bone.
Correct.
So right pelvic bone is one of the bones. Left pelvic bone is the second of the bones that make up the pelvis.
Well, they actually have fancy names, but there are a left side called the innominate, a right side called the innominate, and they both are joined left and right at the sacrum, which is at the base of the spine.
That's the tailbone that hurts when you slip and fall on the ice.
It's the very bottom of that bone, yes.
Okay, all right. Innominate is INNOMINATE.
That's correct.
Okay, now, so you actually had 3 bones that you thought associated with the pelvis under tag 8675 from the quarry file.
That's correct.
2 that look from the right pelvis, 1 from the sacroiliac. Sacroiliac?
The iliac crest. So it would be either this topmost area, what you can feel when you palpate or touch your hip, or from the right side, that's correct.
Were these fragments too small to suggest to you whether they might be male or female?
It was not a matter of size, but simply what parts of the bone we had that would not allow that determination.
When you say cuts, you saw cuts on these. Are you able to be any more specific about the type of cut that you saw?
It was a long, linear cut on either side of those 2 bones that were still in proximity. They were essentially a slicing cut on one side and a sharp slicing cut on the other side.
Any way to tell what instrument may have made that cut?
Objection, lack of foundation.
I can ask some foundational questions.
Go ahead.
If that would help. One of the things you do in your work is look for human damage to bones or damage caused by human agency, if you will.
If present, yes.
If present. I mean, you look for it. Sometimes it's present, sometimes it's not, but you are always looking for it.
Correct.
You look for that here.
Oh, yes.
Damage to the bones by human agency, correct?
Oh, that's correct.
The unnatural defect that you were describing in the parietal and occipital bones yesterday was an example.
Oh, that's correct.
Another common example would be to look for evidence of cutting that you might see in bone.
That's correct.
Now that actually may give you some help on occasion in deciding whether you are looking at a human bone or an animal bone. If the piece is so small that you can't tell the difference, in the sense that animals might often be butchered and you would see signs of cutting near the ends or joints of bones.
That's correct.
Are you able to, not every time now, but on occasion, are you able to draw any professional conclusions about what type of instrument may have used to cut? Or is that beyond what you can do?
That is beyond my expertise and certainly would refer that kind of work out to someone who specializes in that kind of analysis.
Okay, you may have some suspicions, but wouldn't feel competent to make a final conclusion.
As to what instrument
Right.
may have caused the cut, that's correct.
Are you capable of discerning the characteristic differences between a cut made by something that's sawtooth and a cut made by a smooth edge?
Visually, that is often possible to do.
But again, a final conclusion you would refer out.
Yes, I would.
All right. Did it appear to your eyes that these cuts were, if you could draw any conclusion at all, that the cuts on these pelvis bones were from a smooth-edged instrument or a toothed instrument?
I cannot answer your question.
Very well, but the cuts were fairly long and straight cuts.
Objection. She's indicated this is beyond her ability to answer these types of questions.
No. I think that you did testify to, if I heard you just a minute or so ago, describing the cut more specifically, you said, or maybe I misheard you, they were fairly long cuts.
I will overrule the objection because I think the question goes to not what type of instrument it came from, but rather the appearance of what she saw in the bone.
And the court is right. Not interested in the instrument, just what you did see about the cut again.
That they were straight and linear, but because of the burning and the charring of the bone itself, it was difficult to make any additional observations beyond that.
All right. Could you tell, for example, whether the cuts went horizontal to the ground or vertical?
If I could place those two adjoining fragments in anatomical position, which I was able to do as part of the right pelvic structure, those cuts were made on either side in what I would call a north-south direction and up and down direction.
Up and down if the skeleton or person was oriented as I am now, standing up.
Correct.
Okay, these three small fragments you described were not the only bone fragments that you found under tag 8675.
That's correct.
There were 10 bone fragments in total, or in addition to the pelvic bone fragments?
In addition.
Okay, so we're talking about a total of 13 bone fragments.
There were also non-human unboned bones. Burned.
Unburned bones.
Unburned bones. Thank you.
Okay.
Under that same tag number?
Okay, but 13 bone fragments that were burned.
Correct.
The charring and partial calcine condition that you saw was essentially consistent with the charring and the calcine condition that you saw in human bone fragments from the Yander burn barrel and behind Stephen Avery's garage.
That is correct, sir.
Of the 13 charred bone fragments under tag 8675, only one of those was clearly non-human.
No, certainly more than one was non-human.
Of the 13?
Yes.
Okay, let's go to your report. I'm interested here, I think, in the first report at page 9.
Yes, sir, I am there.
I was looking at the second full paragraph down on page 9 of your first report.
Yes, sir.
So what you saw is a tag 8675 contained many elements of unburned non-human bone, which you just told us, right?
Yes.
And other items, as well as 10 fragments of bone with suspected cut marks.
Yes, that's what I have written.
Okay. 8 of the 10 fragments, one definite non-human, were burned calcined.
That's correct.
So of the 8 burned bone fragments that showed suspected cut marks, of those 8, one was definitely non-human.
At that point in my analysis, that's as much as I knew.
Okay. Were you later able to establish more in terms of separating non-human from human among the 10 bone fragments that we're discussing now?
I was.
And what was the separation you eventually made?
I do not have my working notes here with me in court today, and I am unfortunately not able to answer that question with any certainty.
Just don't remember now.
I do not.
Do you remember the bottom line being that the 3 pelvic area bones that you have described, you continue to suspect may be human but can't be certain?
That is correct.
And as to the other 10 charred bones, are there some that you continue to suspect may be human but can't be certain?
There is that possibility. I should say that none of those fragments are diagnostic. In other words, I cannot associate them with one particular bone or another.
Right. And I know you can't give us a number anymore among the 10 charred bone fragments that weren't pelvic, but the bottom line is that you still suspect that some of them may be human. You are not certain of that?
The 3 larger fragments that show burn patterns consistent with burn patterns found on human bone elsewhere on the property, yes.
Okay, very well. Of the bone fragments under tag 8675 from the quarry pile that you suspect may be human, were the 2 from the right pelvic bone or the right innominate bone the only 2 that you were able to associate with each other?
Actually, they came to me still articulated.
Oh, okay.
The bones were in anatomical position when I received them.
As they arrived.
Correct.
Others, because they were non-diagnostic, you couldn't associate one with the other.
That's correct. Non-diagnostic and much, much smaller.
So in the same way then, if we go back to the child's nursery rhythm, the leg bone is connected to the knee bone and the knee bone is connected to the shin bone and the shin bone to the ankle bone, that kind of thing. You are obviously unable to tell us whether these fragments were from contiguous or, associated bones.
The non-bone pelvic fragments, I cannot.
What we have then, I guess in the end first, your conclusion was that the vast majority of human bone fragments presented to you under all tag numbers, quarry pile, Yander burn barrel, Stephen Avery's garage area, or behind Stephen Avery's garage, the vast majority of the human bone fragments from all those sites, collectively, the vast majority was found behind Stephen Avery's garage.
That's correct.
All of these exhibited similar charring and calcine appearance.
That is correct.
From all 3 sites.
The human bone, yes.
All of them were fragmented similarly from the 3 sites again, human bone.
That's correct.
And while you made mention yesterday briefly to not knowing what the weather was, and whether some weather condition might have caused bone fragments to be found east or west or south of the burn pits at Stephen Avery's garage, do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Testimony, you certainly would agree that it would be very strange weather conditions indeed that would transport human bone fragments from the Avery garage area into burn barrel number 2 on the Yander property.
In fact, I would submit that there would be no weather conditions that could make that happen.
You would rule that out.
I would.
Likewise, the quarry pile.
Yes, sir.
All right. So what you conclude is that by human agency, the bone fragments were moved or located where they were found.
Some bone fragments identified as human had been moved. That's correct.
Including, I think we agreed yesterday, possibly human bone fragments found in a general area behind Stephen Avery's garage.
Based on some of the information you provided me with yesterday, there is some evidence for dispersal.
All right.
That's correct.
Now, you have no evidence that human bone fragments were actually burned at more than one site, do you?
I do not know that.
You just don't have any evidence that there were multiple burn sites, correct?
Not based on the material I was given to examine.
Right. And in any event, the burning, charring, calcining, all was roughly consistent as between the three sites, quarry, Yander burn barrel, and behind Avery's garage.
I'm going to object to that question. This is the third time that question has been asked in this context. The witness indicated that she cannot say the bones at the quarry site were human to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty.
Okay.
So whether they are burned or calcined or not charred or burned or whatever it is irrelevant.
Let's do it this way. I don't agree that it's irrelevant, but let me take the human qualifier out. The bone fragments, here we have to set aside the completely non-bone fragments, animal bones that weren't burned.
Right.
But the burnt bone fragments that you saw from the three sites again, all were roughly similar in their burning, charring and calcining.
That is correct.
You are aware that the burn pit behind Mr. Avery's garage was one possible burn site, if you will, on the property that the various properties that the police examined?
Yes, that's true.
That burn pit was described to you as, again, this sort of rectangular area that was at grade, but sort of surrounded by a higher mound of dirt.
I don't. My understanding was that it was a mound itself, and the pit was part of that mound that may or may not be correct.
Right. And have you ever seen a photograph of that burn pit?
I have not.
All right. I won't show you one then. But essentially, this was described to you as an open burn area, although possibly with sides to it.
Correct.
You are familiar with a burn barrel, correct? And the general idea of a burn barrel?
Yes, I am.
Seen pictures of burn barrels?
Yes.
A burn barrel here would be a possible burn site for a human cremation.
I guess anything is possible.
Well, burn barrels are used for burning things, right?
Most often not used for burning human remains.
Shouldn't be.
However,
It should not be used for burning human remains, but a burn barrel would be large enough to put a human being in if one wanted to.
Depending on the size of the barrel, it's possible.
Okay, and the jury has seen the barrels here, so were you aware of an aluminium smelter on the Avery salvage property?
Only insofar as that item was described in Trooper Austin's report.
Aware of the large wood furnace on the Avery salvage property?
I cannot say for sure.
All right, and again then you have no way of knowing what other possible burn sites that were in a quarry or anywhere else in the vicinity of Wisconsin, or of course.
That's correct.
Do you have enough experience with burnt human remains to know whether an enclosed burn area will do a faster job of cremating human remains than an unenclosed burn area?
I would respond to that by saying That's really outside of my range of expertise.
Okay, so the answer is you just don't know.
I do not know.
All right. Is it also outside your area of expertise to offer an opinion on whether a burn area that's actually fed with a source of flammable gas or fluid would cremate faster than a burn area that did not have, was not fed by flammable gas or fluid?
Again, I would offer the same response. That's beyond my range of expertise.
What you can say is that the burnt human bone fragments that you saw from behind Stephen Avery's garage as they came to you were consistent with human bone fragments that could have been moved to that site after burning.
I would have to answer no to that question.
Why were they inconsistent with human bone fragments that could have been moved to that site after burning?
My answer would be that with the hypothetical transport that you are talking about, the moving of bones, I would expect to see some breakage to some fragments or many fragments with that transport. And the kinds of signs that I would look for breakage would be a bone break, where on the surface is the break. The break would be lighter in color than the surrounding burned bone, which would indicate to me a more recent break from handling, whatever caused that handling, and I did not see anything like that.
Well, we do know that the very recovery of burned bone fragments from behind Mr. Avery's garage involved shoveling, correct?
That's correct.
Transport to a sifting screen.
Yes, sir.
The sifting on the screen, correct?
Correct.
Some of them falling through to a second screen.
Yes, sir.
Some of them falling through altogether to a top below.
If that's how they set it up.
All right. Possibly sifting on a second screen.
Possibly, yes.
And from all of that, you saw no breakage or spalling of the human bone fragments you looked at?
I did not.
But I think we have also established that as bones from behind the garage came to you, we have no way of knowing their relationship to one another or to the human skeletal anatomy as they were found.
We do not know the relationship of one fragment to the next That's correct. But we do have general locational information assigned to individual tag numbers.
Right, just behind the garage, for example.
Yes.
All right. So while shoveling and sifting may not have produced this sort of breakage, you think that bones being carried in a barrel or some other container and poured out would have produced breakage. Is that your opinion?
I really can't answer that question.
Okay. So you are not able to say that the bone fragments you found are inconsistent with having been transported to the burn area and poured out there.
Are you referring to the bone fragments from the burn barrel?
No. I'm talking about the burn fragments of human bone found behind Mr. Avery's garage.
Are you asking me, were they transported there?
No, you obviously don't know whether they were or not transported. You weren't there.
I was not there. But
I was not there. Sorry.
I was not there. I was not there. But based on my archaeological experience and the volume of burned human bone fragments behind the garage, I find it highly unlikely that was not the primary burn location.
All right. But I guess that rests on an opinion that transport in a barrel or some other container and being poured out would have done more damage to those human bone fragments than shoveling, sifting, putting into a box and transporting to Madison would have done.
I really don't know.
You don't know one way or the other.
That's correct.
What you do know is that somehow bones were transported from one place to another place because they were wound up in at least two different spots. Human bones, that is, behind Avery's garage and in the Yander burn barrel.
There was transport.
Objection to the question. She just indicated that there was not a transport, in her opinion, to the burn pit. So there was only one transport of human bone that the testimony has revealed. So I object to the question as a mischaracterization.
Mr. Strang,
I don't think it's a mischaracterization at all, and she certainly could answer here. The fact that she said the bones clearly were transported, moved from original location, both behind the garage and by dint of the fact that they were found in the underburn barrel.
that her previous testimony was that they were moved from behind the garage?
No, moved somewhere. Somehow the bones were moved because they were found in at least these two separate locations.
Let's ask her again.
Human bone fragments were moved here. That's your professional conclusion, isn't it?
There is evidence from the Avery property that there was transport of human bone, and I believe that transport occurred from the original burn pit and adjacent areas to barrel number 2.
And you base that opinion on what?
On the overwhelming majority of burned human bone fragments behind the garage in the area and adjacent areas of the burn pit, the finding of very delicate and fragmentary dental structures within that universe, if you will, of burned human bone fragments behind the garage, and absolutely none, for example, in burn barrel number 2. And it's my opinion that if transport occurred from the burn barrel to the burn pit, then there would have been a greater representation left over in the burn barrel of more of the skeleton. And I do not see that. I also would expect to see a lesser volume of material found in burn barrel number 2, along with the few human bone fragments that were in there.
Well, I guess if someone was taking the burn barrel to the Avery garage area and was trying very hard, or thought he or she had dumped everything out of the burn barrel, we might see very little in the burn barrel. That's true, isn't it?
Very little human bone or...
Yes, very little human bone in the burn barrel.
That is true, but that's also assuming that the person who does that can distinguish between human bone and non-human bone.
Because you saw much more non-human bone in the burn barrel.
Unburned, non-human bone and larger bones, larger non-human bones as well.
And some burned non-human bones in the burn barrel.
Some possible burned non-human bones in the burn barrel.
And again, you did not see the burn barrel in place, correct?
I have never visited the property, so I have not seen the burn barrel in place.
The contents of the burn barrel came to you in one of these sealed bins.
That's correct.
So you have no idea and aren't able to tell this jury what the layering was in the burn barrel itself?
That's correct.
You found in the burn barrel, similarly, no evidence of breakage caused by transport?
That's correct.
The same would be true of the possible human bones in the quarry pile, no breakage associated with transit?
That's correct.
And just so I'm clear, every one of these human or suspected human bone fragments, by the time they reached you, had been transported into a plastic bin or some container and then transported 90 or 100 or 110 miles, whatever it is, to Madison, Wisconsin?
That's correct. The quarry area contained those suspected possible human bones. That's right.
But I'm also talking about the Yander burn barrel and Stephen area, Stephen Avery garage now.
That's correct. It was collected and transported to me.
All transported?
Yes.
A large number of bone fragments in a bin, lying one against the other?
Correct.
And even after all that transport, you didn't see, when you finally had a chance to look at these human bone fragments, you didn't see a sign of breakage?
I did not, and I was very careful in looking for any and all evidence to look carefully at the ends of every fragment.
Including those delicate dental structures you just mentioned a few moments ago.
That's correct.
If I understand your opinion, Dr. Eisenberg, you think the most probable burn site here, on the evidence you have, is the area behind Stephen Avery's garage?
Yes, sir.
All right. As you sit here, though, you cannot rule out another burn site as being a possible site of burning of these human bone fragments, can you?
I cannot.
You are a reasonable person?
Oh, I hope so.
I think so. And you cannot reasonably rule out another possible burn site, can you?
Based on the information I have at hand, I cannot.
That's all I have.
Mr. Fallon.
Thank you. Doctor, let's start with the line of questioning regarding your finding a complete absence of breakage, spalling, and damage to these fragments after they were removed from the pit, sifted by law enforcement, and transported to you. What does that tell you about the recovery efforts engaged in by officers and crime lab personnel?
It indicates to me that whoever had an opportunity to handle those remains and recover those remains and package them and transport them did not add any additional damage or did not create any artificial damage that I examined when I looked at the remains.
Given the condition of the remains, did that suggest to you that these remains were carefully extracted from their location and presented to you?
That would be the conclusion I would draw.
All right. Now, just so we're crystal clear on this, the various fragments from the gravel pits southwest of the property, originally you were only able to determine one was clearly non-human. In your subsequent review and analysis, you determined several more were clearly not human. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And as a matter of fact, there was only 3 left that you had a reasonable suspicion on that could be human. Is that correct?
That could possibly be human. That is correct.
And as a matter of fact, as you sit here today, you cannot tell us that those bones, to a reasonable degree of anthropological or scientific certainty, are human, can you?
With my hand behind my back and my fingers crossed and throwing some holy water, I cannot.
All right. Now, you did offer an opinion that you believe that the location of the primary burning episode here was the burn pit behind the garage. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Would you please elaborate for us your reasoning on that?
Number 1, in the order of priority, would be that the overwhelming majority of fragments, burn fragments, that were identified by me as human were found in that location, behind the garage, in and adjacent to the burn pit, that were there. In my opinion, many small, delicate, brittle fragments that would have been left behind someplace else had that not been the primary burn location. And if that had been the case, I would have been able to recognize those fragments from another location and did not, except for burn barrel number 2, and that all the human bone fragments that were fragmented and badly burned from that location showed the same, approximately the same degree of charring, burning, and calcination, variously throughout the material recovered in the burn pit and adjacent areas.
Since you have concluded that the burn pit was the location of the primary burning episode, tell us why, in your opinion, burn barrel number 2 would not have been.
I believe that burn barrel number 2 would not have been the primary burn location, because I would have expected to find more bone fragments that I would have been able to. Bone fragments and human bone fragments and dental structures that I would have been able to identify as human in burn barrel number 2 than actually I was the than actually were found.
Now, this may be a self-evident question, but I want to make sure we all understand. Given the nature and condition of the fragments you examined, would it have required professional training and experience to be able to identify human from non-human bone? If such bones were for someone to transport those bones. In other words, would someone have to know human from non-human?
That's wildly speculative, Your Honour.
Let me see if I can rephrase on that or articulate that question. It's poorly worded. I agree with counsel. Let's keep it simple. Given the nature and the condition of the charring, the calcine defect on these bones, does it take a professional such as yourself to be able to clearly identify human from non-human burned bone?
Well, since I have a PhD, I would say yes, except when non-human bone is of a size and intact that someone might recognize a deer bone or some other non-human bone. But yes, I would agree with you. Given the charring and burning and calcination of the fragments, in fact, the majority of the contents of the burn pit and adjacent area, that yes, it would take someone who has the experience looking and identifying human from non-human bone fragments.
Would you say the same for what was found in burn barrel number 2?
Yes, I would.
That's all. Thank you.
Any redirect?
It would take much less experience with anatomy or identifying bone to distinguish burn from non-burn bone. That's true?
Would you ask that again? I'm sorry.
It would take much less experience to distinguish burned bone from non-burned bone, wouldn't it?
Yes, sir, it would.
You also found non-human bone under the tag numbers that reportedly came from behind Mr. Avery's garage.
Yes.
And taking all 3 sites, the quarry, the Yander burn barrel, and the Avery garage area, as a whole for the fragments that you found that were burned, the burning, charring, and calcination was roughly similar from all 3 places, wasn't it?
Asked and answered.
I will allow it as a clarification of some of the other questions that have been asked.
Actually, I would say no to your question. I would indicate that in the quarry location, tag number 8675, there was non-human bone intact. In other words, it wasn't fragmentary, most of it, and was clearly unburned. And it was in 8675 that there were more unburned non-human bone than...
We're going past each other, and it's my fault. Of the burned, I mean you found some burned bone from all 3 sides.
That's correct.
And of the burned bone that you found, the condition was roughly similar in all 3 sites.
That is correct.
That's all. Well, that's all.
Mr. Fallon, anything else?
No, thank you. The witness may be excused.
Right. The witness will be excused at this time, and given the time, I believe we'll take a morning break at this time. Members of the jury, remember not to discuss the case amongst yourselves during the break. You may be seated. We'll resume in 15 minutes. Counsel, there was some mention earlier of a stipulation. Is there something the parties wish to present at this time, or should we bring the jurors back in?
Mr. Fallon is doing it. We have reached a stipulation, and I assume he's sort of retyping it, the language of it, Your Honour.
Okay.
But I can't speak for him on that. I'm just assuming that. I know we agreed on the language.
Was it something the parties wanted to present to the jury before we begin the next witness?
I think he does, and it would make sense to do it.
All right. Mr. Fallon, do I understand the parties have a stipulation they wish to read to the jury?
Yes, Judge. The parties, sorry for the delay, but the parties wanted to make sure that Dr. Eisenberg's testimony was complete before we could finalize the language on a stipulation, saving us the production of a witness for Virginia from the FBI laboratory, one Dr. Les McCurdy. I don't know what the court's preference is. If you'd like one of us to read it, or the court might want to read it, it matters not to me.
If the parties wish, I will read it. Otherwise, one of you can read it.
I would think, since it's a stipulation between the parties, I think it would be better if Mr. Fallon read it.
Very well.
All right.
Anything else before we bring the jurors back in? Okay. We can bring the jurors in at this time.
Oh, it should move in 401 and 402 while we're waiting, Your Honour.
You can do that in front of the jury, and I will go along with that.
All right. You may be seated. Mr. Strang, I understand that the defence wishes to move the admission of some exhibits.
I do. I move admission of Exhibit 401, which was the skeleton diagram tag 7964, and Exhibit 402, which was a schematic map of the Avery salvage yard, and then the quarry pile site. I also used, for demonstrative purposes, a third image of a skeleton, and it matters not to me whether that's marked and admitted or not. It was used simply for demonstrative purposes.
Any objection to the admission of the marked exhibits?
I have no objection to the admission of 401 and 402, and nor do I think it's necessary for us to produce a photograph of the exhibit counsel used for demonstrative purposes, so...
Very well. 401 and 402 will then be deemed admitted.
Yes, thank you, Judge. The parties have agreed to that the bone fragments identified as human from the burn pit behind Stephen Avery's garage, bone fragments identified as human from burn barrel number 2 behind the residence of Barb Yonda, and bone fragments suspected as possible human bones from the quarry pile in the redundant gravel pit south of the Avery salvage yard were sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia on November 2nd, 2006, November 7th, 2006, and December 19th, 2006 to attempt further DNA analysis. If called to testify, Dr. Leslie McCurdy of the FBI DNA Analysis Unit would testify that due to the condition of the submitted bone fragments, no DNA examinations could be conducted.
And Mr. Strang, is that an accurate statement of the party's stipulation?
It is. That's the stipulation as to Dr. McCurdy's testimony, were he called.
Thank you. Members of the jury, you may take those facts as established, and at this time, then, the state may call its next witness.
Thank you, Judge. The state calls Curtis Thomas to the stand.
Please be seated. Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
Curtis Thomas, Thomas.
Good morning, Mr. Thomas, and thank you for making it here. Could you tell the jury, please, what you do for a living?
Yes, I'm an electronics engineer with the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
And from which FBI office are you stationed?
I'm stationed currently in Quantico, Virginia.
Placed in front of you, Mr. Thomas, is an exhibit, number 403. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Tell the jury what that is, please.
It's my curriculum vitae. It's basically a resume of what I have done in my current position.
Working for the FBI, what do you currently do? In other words, what is your day usually made up of doing?
We examine electronic devices such as cell phones, PDAs, other various electronic circuits that may contain electronic data pertaining to a crime.
Are you ever asked to make identification of electronic components?
Yes, we are.
Mr. Thomas, let me ask you if you do that in a forensic capacity. In other words, after your examinations in the laboratory, are you sometimes asked to come to court or otherwise apply this to legal principles?
Yes, I am.
The FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, does that enjoy any certifications?
Yes, we are currently ASCLD lab certified.
You're going to have to explain what that means.
It's an association of criminal laboratory directors laboratory accreditation board is what the full acronym stands for. It's basically an internal validation that we go through to make sure that we're following all the rules and handling the evidence in the proper manner.
All right. Exhibit number 403, your curriculum vitae. Does that include your educational background?
Yes, it does.
And can you just briefly describe what that is for the jury?
I have a bachelor's degree in computer engineering.
To entitle you or to allow you to perform examinations and make identifications of electronic equipment. Have you had any specific training? And do you have experience in that field?
I have received training as far as electronic forensic examinations and how to handle evidence properly. As far as identification goes, we handle many different kinds of cell phones on a daily basis, and therefore I'm familiar with many different models and makes of cell phones.
Are you familiar with the term exemplar or standard?
Yes, I am.
Does your lab in Quantico, Virginia have exemplars or standards for, let's first talk about cell phones.
Yes, we do.
Can you describe that for jury, please?
We have a cabinet area that contains any sort of cell phone that we have received in for examination. We generally buy a copy of it so that we can performance test on it before we do examinations on the actual evidence and make sure we don't change anything.
All right. These exemplars, these standards or examples, if you will, do you have those for electronic devices other than cell phones?
Yes, we do. We have PDAs and also GPS devices.
We need to slow down just a little bit. For those jurors who don't know what a PDA is, what is that?
PDA stands for Personal Digital Assistance, such as a Palm Pilot or a Pocket PC device.
What are those used for generally?
Generally, they're used to house contact information and function as an electronic calendar.
All right. Does your unit analyze electronic components on a daily basis? That's a poor question. Let me ask it a different way. Are there individuals other than you in Quantico, Virginia, at the FBI lab that do this kind of work as well?
Yes, I work in an office of 5 people.
All right. How do you typically receive submissions for analysis, Mr. Thomas?
We're generally sent a communications request or assistance and detailing what we are asked to do.
All right. Who is that generally sent by?
Generally sent from the FBI field office, but it also accepts requests from local police officers as well.
I guess my question is, you generally get requests from law enforcement agency?
That's correct.
You don't do this kind of thing for the general public or for some corporation or something, do you?
No, we do not.
Let me ask you, Mr. Thomas, in this case, now, were you asked not only by a local agency, the Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigation, but the local field office of the FBI here in Wisconsin to analyze some electronic components that were recovered?
Yes, I was.
Investigator Wiegert from the Calumet Sheriff's Department is going to bring you an exhibit. He's first going to open it. It's been marked as exhibit number 415. I'm going to ask you if you are able to identify that box, and then I will have you identify the contents.
I do recognize the box. The box the evidence was sent to us in.
Okay. If you would be so kind, Mr. Thomas, as to open that box for the jury and tell the jury what's in that box, please.
This is 411?
It's 415.
415.
This box contains burnt electronic components.
All right. As we go through that box, I'm going to show you some exhibits as well. I'm first going to show you some photos, but to assist you, I'm going to show you what you're going to see that's marked as exhibit number 404. I ask you to refer to the large screen here in the courtroom and tell us what the jurors are looking at, please.
That is the layout of basically all the components that are inside this box, spread out in a more easy to view fashion.
All right. When electronic components are recovered, whether they are burned or whether they are recovered at some other potential crime scene, you typically receive them in a package form, similar to what's in front of you as Exhibit 415.
We received them in various different containers, including paint cans that have been sealed up, boxes that have been taped up, just pretty much whatever the evidence is collected in, they send to us.
All right, let's look at exhibit number 404 generally. And why don't you give us an overview? Why don't you tell the jury? You have a laser pointer, by the way, in front of you. If you would like to use that, please feel free. Just give us an overview and tell the jury what it is that these components are and what it is that we're looking at here.
There are components from approximately 3 devices in here. You can see here, this is the front cover for a Motorola Razr cellular telephone. This is the back cover of the same phone. This here is some of the front internal pieces. This is the front lens cover for a PowerShot camera from Canon. This right here is the circuit board that's inside the Pan-Sizer PDA. And these little rectangular devices are pieces of compact flash memory cards that would go inside the camera to hold the pictures.
Now, you have talked about at least three distinct electronic components. One of them was a cell phone. Let's start with that first. In the submission from the Division of Criminal Investigation and our local law enforcement agencies, what were you asked to do, if anything, with that particular cell phone?
When the device was sent to us, they asked us if we could extract any electronic data from the cell phone.
In the condition that you received it in the burned condition that we now see all of these components, were you able to extract any data from that cell phone?
No, I was not.
Let me ask you, Mr. Thomas, were you asked to extract, if you could, any images from the digital camera that was sent to you as well?
Yes, I was.
Tell the jury, how does a digital camera work, generally, and then explain for the jury what process or what you did to try to extract data from that.
A digital camera works by taking in light through the lens. It's then stored in an electronic nature onto a compact flash card, of which there are several in this submission. As far as in this case, pretty much no effort was taken to retrieve electronic information, because upon looking at it, it was obvious that everything was damaged too far to retrieve any such information.
All right. You talked about a flash card or the actual memory card that kind of goes into the camera. Are you able to just point out to the jury? We may see some other pictures of that, but point to the jury where those memory cards or flash cards that go into a camera are.
There's one here, a couple more here, and a couple more here. Pretty much anything up here that's around this size came from it. They kind of split into sometimes multiple pieces. So each one of those little rectangles doesn't represent an individual compact flash card, but perhaps more just a piece of the ones that was submitted.
And again, You weren't able to retrieve any data from that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
At some point, Mr. Thomas, you told the jury that you found a third component. Can you describe that, please?
Yes. As we were examining the evidence that was sent to us, we noted that there was more components than would be just left over from a burned cell phone and a burned camera. And we noticed that it was mainly this circuit board right here. And this is the main board to a PAMZIRE PDA.
All right, let's go through the components. Some are probably going to be easier than others. What I'm going to have you look at in front of you is exhibit number 405. Tell the jury what that is, please.
That is the back cover for a Motorola Razr cell phone.
And how do you know that that's for a Motorola Razr cell phone?
You can clearly see the M here, which is the Motorola logo. And we also have an exemplar at the FBI lab to compare it to.
All right, Motorola Razr. Is that also known as a different model number or type?
Yes, it's also known as a V3.
All right. Can you describe for the jury, for those jurors who haven't heard of this kind of phone? Is this commonly used or a common type of cell phone?
Yes, all 4 of the major cellular carriers offer one.
Offer one what?
A Motorola Razr cell phone.
Do you know anybody that has one?
Yes, I do. My wife actually has one.
Okay. I'm going to show you, Mr. Thomas, what has been marked as exhibit number 406. Again, these are photographs that are in front of you, so if you need a closer look, you can certainly take them. Tell the jury, what is exhibit 406?
Exhibit 406 is the back cover of the burned cell phone, again being compared with our exemplar that we have at Quantico.
What does that mean? Why don't you use the laser pointer and tell us what you're talking about?
Basically, this is the burned evidence that was sent to us here, and this is our device that we have at the lab. And basically, we just took pictures of them side by side to show what it would have looked like before it was burned.
Next exhibit that might help the jury is exhibit 407. Tell us what that is, please.
Yes, that is the front cover of the Motorola Razr cell phone, being compared once again with the exemplar device that we have.
All right. And why, Mr. Thomas, at least in these images, is the exemplar placed right next to the evidence, the burned evidence that was recovered in this case?
It's for comparison purposes, so you can clearly see where the burned evidence came from in the original device.
So in 407, if you could show us the burned evidence that was recovered and what part of the phone that is.
All right. This is the burned evidence piece right here, and you can clearly see here is the Motorola logo, which also appears over here, and you can also clearly see this little speaker port, which is cut into the front cover of the phone as well as this rectangular piece for the camera being cut out.
Finally, or at least finally regarding the phone, I'm going to have you look at exhibit number 408 and tell us what the jurors are looking at here, please.
This is the internal keypad, which is present on this here is the burned evidence again, and this here is our exemplar.
And that's the internal keypad for a Motorola V3 Razr phone.
That's correct.
After your visual examination and after examining the exemplar, were you able then to identify those components, at least the components that you have shown the jury here today, as coming from a particular cell phone?
Yes, I was.
And what was that conclusion that you were able to draw?
We were able to conclude that these pieces came from a Motorola Razr V3 cell phone.
Next item that you had talked about was a digital camera. Just very quickly, however, I'm going to just show you the rest of the photos that were provided. What's exhibit number 409? What is exhibit number 409? The picture.
Oh, exhibit 409 is, once again, just pieces of the burned cell phone placed together.
All right. And exhibit 410?
Exhibit 410 is simply a photo of some of the burned evidence placed together.
Okay. And from exhibit 410, do you see any items that are associated with a digital camera?
Yes, this piece right here is a lens cover for a Canon PowerShot camera.
As we zoom in on exhibit 410, this might be kind of obvious to everybody, but do you see any markings on that digital camera cover that helped you in identifying what kind of camera this came from?
Yes, there's the word PowerShot A310 appear.
All right. And I understand that you do this for a living and are probably an expert in this, but you don't need to be an expert to see what camera this is from, do you?
No, you do not.
That notwithstanding, Mr. Thomas, there were other electronic components to the camera that were recovered. Is that right?
That's correct.
And again, could you provide those for the jury? Are those shown in this exhibit, or do you need to go to a different exhibit?
It's in a different photo.
All right, let me go to those, please. I'm first going to show you again another exhibit, that is exhibit 411, a little clearer picture of the name. Do you see that?
Yes.
Again, what does that say?
It says PowerShot A310.
What's exhibit number 412? What are we looking at?
Burned pieces of a Motorola Razr V3 cell phone.
All right, and exhibit 413?
It's another zoom in on the earlier shot that contained all the burned evidence laid out.
Now, does any of this evidence associate with the camera itself?
Yes, it does.
Can you show that for the jury, please?
This circuit board right here is from the digital camera.
From the A310?
Yes.
Is there anything else that you see that is obviously associated with the camera?
Other than the compact flash cards, no.
I'm going to leave this exhibit up. Let me ask your opinion. Based upon the exhibits that you have now shown these jurors, are you able, and were you in this case, able to identify from which digital camera those components came?
Yes, I was.
What was that camera?
We determined it was a PowerShot A310.
From Canon?
That's correct.
All right. Let's talk about PDAs a little bit. You said that stood for what?
Personal Digital Assistance.
I think you mentioned one of the brands of a PDA was something called a Palm Pilot.
That's correct.
Are there other brands of, are there other brands of PDAs?
Yes, there are.
And what are some of those, if you know?
Pocket PC and also BlackBerry.
Now, have you heard of a manufacturer of a personal digital assistant that's called a Palmsire or Palmsire?
Palm is the manufacturer of that device, yes.
The Palmsire 31, that particular model, do you have familiarity with that?
Yes, I do.
And at the time of your examination, at the time that you did what was asked of you by local law enforcement, describe for the jury what, if any, familiarity you had with that particular brand of PDA?
That particular PDA, we just happened to be working on downloading memory and such from that device, so I was familiar with what it looked like, both inside and out.
Mr. Thomas, I'm going to take you back to our original exhibit, that is, exhibit number 404. Have you looked at this? And again, if you're able, from exhibit 404, which is all the components that were recovered in this case, if you could point to the large screen as to which of those components are associated with the palm Zyre.
This here is the main circuit board of the palm Zyre, and these two clear pieces of glass, one of them is the screen, the LCD screen for the glass, or for the PDA, and the other one is what's known as the digitizer for the PDA.
You're going to need to tell us what a digitizer is, please.
PDAs allow you to touch the screen to input information into them, and the digitizer is the piece of technology that allows this to take place. It records where you tapped on the screen and sends that information to the PDA.
Now, as I don't own one of these deals, but when you say somebody taking out something that looks like a pen and they tap it on the screen, is that the digitizer thing that you're talking about?
That's correct.
Looking at these components and looking and describing for the jury, were you able to identify then from what personal digital assistant these components came?
Yes, I was.
Could you describe that for the jury, please?
We determined that they came from a Palm Zyre 31 PDA.
I will have you look at exhibit number 404, which are a photograph of all the components, and compare that to the box that's in front of you, exhibit 415. Does it appear that the electronic components photographed in 404 are the very same components that not only are in front of you in 415, but were also analyzed by you?
Yes, they are the same.
The identification of electronics and electronic components, does that require specialized training and experience?
Yes, it does.
And again, you believe that you have that through your work with the FBI?
That's correct.
Your findings, Mr. Thomas, that is, the identification of the Motorola Razr phone, the Canon PowerShot A310, and the Palm Zyre 31. In rendering those opinions, do you hold those opinions to a reasonable degree of professional certainty?
Yes, I do.
And having come to those conclusions, did you have an official report, again, authored by yourself, performed in this case?
Yes.
I'm showing you. Do you have the exhibit number in front of you?
414.
I'm showing you exhibit 414. Tell the jury what that is, please.
This is my report that I generated once I was finishing examining the device.
And does that report include your findings? That is, include the identification of the 3 electronic items that were recovered and which you analyzed and identified?
Yes, it does.
The last 2 exhibits I want you to take a look at are 2 boxes that have been handed to you, exhibit number 8 and exhibit number 9. Could you grab those, please, and tell the jury what those are?
They appear to be consumer electronic devices which are the same, as you can see, be similar to our exemplars that we have in-house.
All right. First of all, they are boxes. Is that right?
They are boxes, yes.
And which one is exhibit number 8? Are you holding that?
Yes.
And could you tell the jury what the box on exhibit 8 reflects?
It says Zyre 31.
And would that be, at least from a manufacturing standpoint, if you went to buy that in a store, would the components or would the non-damaged Palm Sire 31 that you have identified likely be in that box if you purchased it?
Yes, it would.
And show the jury exhibit number 9, please. You can hold it up and show them what that is. What is it?
It is the box for a Canon PowerShot A310.
And once again, would that likely be the box if you had purchased a Canon PowerShot A310? The same box that would contain the undamaged components as you have identified in not only the photographs in exhibit number 415, but also are included in your official FBI report.
Yes.
I would at this time, Judge, move the admissions of exhibit 404 through, I believe it's 415.
Any objection?
No objection.
And I will pass the witness, Judge.
403 was the witness CV.
And 403, I'm sorry, Judge.
Any objection to that?
No objection to that.
Very well. Those exhibits are all admitted. Mr. Buting.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
You've been working at the FBI just for about 3 years now, right?
That's correct.
And there's 5 of you in your particular division?
Yes.
Are they all about as young as you, or some of them quite a bit older?
It varies.
You are at an age where people use these kinds of devices more than probably us old folks anyway, right?
I guess.
You use digital PDAs yourself, right?
I personally do not use a PDA, no.
Oh, really? Okay. But others in your lab do?
Not on a personal basis, no.
Well, as part of their business, do they use them at all?
We use them as part of our job, just to examine them.
Oh, okay. So nobody in your lab actually has these devices?
Not personally, no.
All right. Let me just clear one thing up. The FBI lab, Mr. Kratz, as you indicate, is the submissions from law enforcement, right?
That's correct.
The FBI lab does not do any of these tests for the defense on a case, do they?
Our lab does not, no.
So even if I wanted to use your lab for anything, it's not available?
No.
Okay. You identified, could we put up one of those exhibits, the overall shot, 409 and 410, please?
Do you want 404, the one with all of them?
That's fine. 404, yeah. Yeah, that's the one. Is 404 an overall layout of all of the items that you received, every single one?
That picture was not taken by me. That picture was taken here, as far as I know.
Okay. Does that appear to be an accurate representation of everything that you got in that box, though?
It appears to be all the electronic pieces that were contained in this box.
Okay. And did you make an effort to actually sort of fit these pictures back together?
No, we did not.
So, for instance, do you know whether there's any pieces missing from a complete PDA?
There are pieces missing, just most likely they have been consumed wholly by the fire.
Well, I'm not sure that you can express that opinion, but my point is that not necessarily all of the pieces are there, right?
No.
For instance, there's a case, an outer case that the PDA internal circuit board fits into.
That's correct.
Also a keyboard of some sort.
Yeah. There were 4 buttons at the bottom.
Okay. And I don't know if the same holds true for the cell phone and the camera, but there's buttons and internal components that are missing.
That's correct.
And in some instances, even the outer cases that these components are composed or contained in are also missing.
That's correct.
Okay. The digital camera, have these or uses compact flash, is that what you called it?
Yes.
those little rectangular cards that we put in our cameras.
That's correct.
You said that no effort was made, though, to try and retrieve any digital files from them.
That's correct.
In the course of your work, how many cases have you done where you're working with burned electronics?
I have done a few.
Less than 5?
More likely, yes.
Okay, so most of your work is not dealing with burned electronic parts, it's intact parts.
That's correct.
And in those instances, you're able to take, for instance, a compact flash card and retrieve data from it, potentially, right?
That's correct.
But you never actually tested these cards to see whether there might be some photographs or digital files on the cards.
The condition that these cards were in precludes any sort of testing that we would have done. Least we completely destroyed this evidence. As you touch, most of the stuff is crumbling apart.
Well, for instance, the compact flash cards, could they have been, did you try to insert them into any kind of a card reader?
There was no connector left on most of them.
Okay. The connector being some sort of metal?
It's plastic.
Okay, and you have no other way other than being able to insert them into a card reader to analyze what's on them?
We have the capability to remove the actual flash memory chips from the devices to read them if necessary.
But you didn't do that here?
No.
Okay. And as to the Palm Pilot, you're familiar with how they are used, right?
Yes.
And people keep appointments on them, for instance.
Yes, they do.
So the owner of this one, for instance, may have had appointments that she was going to go on to on her last day that we know of.
It's possible.
As well as future dates for that matter, right?
That's possible.
And how is that information stored on a Palm Pilot?
It's also stored in the flash memory.
Okay. And do you see, or did you find that sort of a flash card amongst this?
The flash, it doesn't store it in a separate flash card as the camera does. It instead uses flash memory that would be contained on the main circuit board.
Okay, and did you make any effort to try to retrieve any of the data from that flash memory on PDA?
No, we did not.
Okay, so you weren't able to find, for instance, whether she had appointments scheduled on her PDA or not?
That's correct.
All right. Thank you, sir. That's all I have.
Just 2 questions. Mr. Thomas, you mentioned, especially when we're talking about combustible or things that are destroyed in a fire, what kinds of components usually, or as you look at this evidence, what kinds of components survived and what kind of components didn't?
In this case, and then
I object. Hold on. I object to the question as to what kind of components didn't. I mean, that's speculative. That calls for speculation. The first part is okay.
I can ask what kind of components aren't here, Judge, and what they are made from.
You can phrase it that way.
Sure, that's fine.
What kind of components survived? What materials or products are these components made from?
are preliminarily metal.
And the components that you don't see, the components that are missing, are you able to say what those are primarily made of?
They are primarily made of plastic.
That's all I have for Mr. Thomas. Thank you.
Just one quick follow-up. Are you able to state that the only missing pieces here are plastic, or are there also potentially some metal pieces that are missing too, that aren't here?
We did not perform that sort of examination, so I'm not certain.
All right. So you don't really know exactly what pieces are missing. You just looked at what pieces you had.
That's correct.
All right. Thank you.
Very well. You are excused.
I would ask that Mr. Thomas be released from his subpoena and be allowed to go back to Virginia.
That's fine.
Very well. You may leave the evidence there.
Okay.
We'll remove those things and we're able to call another witness now, if you would like us to.
State will be calling Bill NEWHOUSE.
You can step over there. Please raise your right hand. Please be seated. Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
William L. NEWHOUSE, NEWHOUSE.
Thank you. Good morning, sir. What do you do for a living?
I'm employed as a firearm and tool mark examiner with the Wisconsin State Crime Lab in Madison, Wisconsin.
How long have you been so employed?
I joined the Wisconsin State Crime Lab in September of 2002.
Prior to joining the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory, what other employment have you held?
Well, I have to back up to 1972. I accepted a position with the California Department of Justice in August of 1972. Out there they called us criminalists, as a trainee, essentially at that time. I didn't really encounter firearms and tool mark work, which is the work I do here in Wisconsin, until probably the fall of 1974. I, at that time, initiated the training courses they had in place in the Sacramento Crime Lab that dealt with the firearms and tool mark section and dealt with the kinds of examinations that we were expected to perform in the course of case examinations in the firearms section. I completed that training course successfully. And January of 1975 then, still working in Sacramento, I was asked to take a week-long course, again as part of my training, that dealt with the theory of identification and how is it you can say anything about a bullet or a cartridge casing and answer questions about whether they were fired from a particular gun or not. After I completed that, and I think the next week, I was in another course that dealt with ammunition problems. I was then assigned to the firearms section of the Sacramento laboratory and was responsible until I left that laboratory for most of the firearms work that I came into that firearms section of the laboratory.
And when were you doing firearms identification work for the state of California? About what time frame are we in?
We're talking about the spring of 1975 until 1981.
And after that, where did you next have professional experience?
I moved to the Montana State Crime Laboratory in January of 1981. Took a position there as that state's firearm and tool mark examiner. While I was there in Montana, I had the opportunity to obtain some additional training. I went to the FBI Academy. It was probably in 1984, approximately. Took a course there. It was a week-long course that dealt with specialized techniques in firearms and tool mark identification. We look at special problems that we encounter in the firearms section, and I was there until November of 1988. At that time, I then moved to Kansas City, Missouri Police Department Crime Laboratory as a firearms and tool mark examiner, one of four in that laboratory, and was responsible primarily for firearms casework in that lab. The last 2 years that I was in the firearms section there, before I came to Wisconsin, I was chief criminalist of the firearms section, in which I had supervisory duties in addition to the casework duties. And then, as I mentioned, in September of 2002, I came from Kansas City up to the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory.
And prior to engaging in this field, did you receive any bachelor's degree from any university?
Yes, I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in physics from Purdue University. I received that in June of 1970.
And did you pursue any postgraduate training, at least in some respects?
I took a number of graduate courses for approximately 2 years until August of 1972, when I went to California. Most of them were in physics courses, and I was doing that while I was looking for employment after I'd got my degree.
All right. First of all, if you could tell us what is firearms and tool mark identification, if you can just generally tell us about that field.
In the firearms section of most crime laboratories, we're dealing with evidence that's recovered in the course of criminal investigations that involve shootings. So obviously, what I'm going to be looking at, in most cases, there's going to be a gun. I'm interested in and have to be able to define how a gun functions, whether it's functioning properly, perhaps whether it's been altered in some cases, and of course, whether or not I can fire the gun safely, or whether or not it was capable of being operated safely in the instant from which it was recovered. I'm also asked to look at bullets and cartridge casings. We fire these guns. The bullets, of course, leave the gun. The cartridge casings, depending on the design of the gun, can leave the gun and are recovered at the crime scenes, occasionally recovered at autopsies. I'm asked to examine those items of evidence, the cartridge casings and bullets. And most often, I'm asked to determine if a gun has been recovered, whether that gun or that bullet or that cartridge casing has been fired in a particular weapon. In those instances where I may not have a gun, then the question may be, was this group of cartridge casings all fired in the same gun, or do we have more than one gun involved? The same questions apply to bullets. So then the next thing I do in that section most frequently is look at bullets and cartridge casings, compare them to test-fired bullets and cartridge casings so that I can answer those questions. The other element of firing the gun involves gunpowder and gunpowder residues. And it's also part of, or one of the duties that I have, to examine clothing, to examine patterns on skin of shooting victims, and answer questions about distance. Can I determine, if possible, what distance the shooting victim may have been from the gun when the gun was discharged?
All right. Do you currently belong to any professional organizations?
I do.
And what are those?
I'm a member and have been for something over 20 years of the Association of Firearms and Tool Mark Examiners.
All right. And have you testified in courts of law regarding your findings and expressed opinions on those findings?
Yes, I have.
Do you have any estimate for us to approximately how often you have been called upon to testify in your court proceedings regarding firearms identification issues?
I'm satisfied it's been much in excess of 300 times at this point.
I believe there's an exhibit placed in front of you. And what is the exhibit number on that exhibit for us?
Exhibit 416.
416. And what is Exhibit 416?
416 is a curriculum vitae, a description of my experience and the training that I've received in this 30-some years of experience I've had in crime laboratories.
All right. Mr. Newhouse, in this particular case, were you called upon to examine some weapons, some bullet fragments, and some cartridges?
Cartridge casings? Yes, I was.
Did you conduct such an examination?
I did.
And were you able to make any findings or any comparisons based on your examinations?
Yes, I did.
All right. Well, before we get into that, if you could, I think it would probably be good if you could define some terms for us. Some of us are not so proficient in firearms technology and language. So, first of all, can you tell us what a cartridge is?
Most of you are probably familiar, if only secondarily through TV, with guns, and know that what you fire in a weapon is a cartridge. You may not be aware of what the different components of a cartridge are, and it's the components, of course, most often, that I'm asked to look at. You're going to hear me talk about some of these parts of a cartridge and how they relate to and connect with different parts of the weapon. A cartridge is a composition of about 4 different parts. A cartridge consists of a cartridge casing, and we'll see some of these later, I presume, at least pictures of them. We also have a bullet or a projectile. That is part of a cartridge. And of course, the bullet is what is aimed at a particular target and what will, if the weapon is working properly and the cartridge works properly, what will strike that target. Inside the cartridge casing, is gunpowder. Gunpowder is a propellant. It's a chemical that under the conditions that we expose it to when we're firing the gun, essentially explodes in the gun. And of course, when it does that, a couple of things happen. It forces the bullet out of the barrel of the weapon and, again, downrange from wherever the weapon is pointed. The last component in a cartridge is what we call a primer. There's a part of the gun that's going to cause the cartridge to fire. That part of the gun actually strikes a different chemical in the gunpowder that's present in the cartridge casing, and that is very shock sensitive. It gets struck, it explodes, it ignites the gunpowder, and then our cartridge fires, and the gun should work as it's intended to.
Generally, on a gun, where would the primer be located or found?
Really, only 2 places on any cartridge, these days at any rate. We may have a rimfire cartridge, and in this case, that's the kind of ammunition that was used. And in the case of a rimfire cartridge, the primer is located around the edge of the head of the cartridge. And we may also have in other weapons a center fire. In that instance, the primer is located in the center of the head or the end of the cartridge.
All right. And you began to explain, I think you did, on how the cartridge is actually fired. So let me ask you then, what happens to the bullet as it is propelled down the barrel and out toward its intended target?
Well, we have to know where the bullet starts out. Of course, it's in the cartridge, but in the weapon, the cartridge is going to be chambered or located right at the end of the barrel of the weapon. The muzzle of the weapon is the very front and most portion of that barrel. And at the back of the barrel will be a part of the barrel that's called the chamber, and it's designed to receive a cartridge. When this cartridge is fired, the bullet is projected or is expelled from the cartridge and into the barrel. If the gun is going to work properly, that barrel has to be sealed by the bullet. That is, no gases can escape around the sides of the bullet. And so the bullet, as it comes down the barrel of the gun, is in contact with that inner surface of the barrel. We have then the lead surface or the copper jacketed surface of the bullet being scraped by the inside of the barrel of the weapon.
All right. What happens to the cartridge when the weapon is fired?
That's going to be determined by the design of the weapon. Some weapons are designed to keep the cartridge, the fired cartridge casing now, inside the weapon so that it has to be extracted manually. In other designs of weapons, allow you to extract the cartridge casings in certain ways. We may have what's called a bolt on a weapon that if you actually pull back and up, and that will cause the cartridge casing that's been fired in the weapon to be extracted and rejected from the weapon. And finally, there's a design of a weapon that's very common that's called a semi-automatic design. And in this instance, the cartridge, when it's fired, the weapon is designed to use the gases, the energy that's created by the explosion of that gunpowder in there, to actually drive back a part of the weapon, extract whole that cartridge casing from the chamber, and then there will be another part of the weapon that the cartridge casing comes into contact with that causes the cartridge casing to be ejected from the weapon. And then, in the next step in this kind of weapon, is that same part of the gun that's driven backward and extracts the fired cartridge casing moves forward again under spring pressure most of the time, and it pushes the next cartridge that's in the weapon up into the chamber, and at the same time cocks the weapon. So on a semi-automatic weapon, if you fire a cartridge in that weapon, it ejects, extracts and ejects the cartridge casing, chambers the next round, cocks the weapon, and now the gun can be fired by a pull of the trigger.
All right. And just so that we're clear, we've had some other terminology used by some of the other witnesses, a phrase called shell casing. What is the relationship, if any, between a cartridge and a shell casing, and what have you?
There's a number of different terms that are used commonly in the public that refer to the same thing. I generally, and in my reports, describe a fired cartridge casing as a cartridge casing, but it can also be called a shell casing. Some people call them hulls. That's generally in shotguns, but It is misused also. If you heard the term shell casing, it's the same thing as what I'm referring to as a cartridge casing.
All right. Given this process that you have described about how, what happens to the bullet upon it's being fired, and what happens to the cartridge casing? What makes firearms identification possible?
You have heard me describe, I think, that when a cartridge casing or cartridge is fired in a gun, that we have contact between different parts of the gun and the cartridge casing. And then I know I described specifically that when the bullet passes through the barrel of the gun, that it's in contact with that inner surface of the barrel. Whenever there is contact between either the bullet and the cartridge casing with a part of the gun, we have the opportunity for a marking to be transferred to that item. Let's talk specifically about the bullet. When that bullet passes through here and is scratched by the inside of the barrel of the weapon, and I look at the surface of the bullet under magnification in the laboratory, what I'm going to see are a series of scratches. We call them stria. They are actually three-dimensional engravings, something more than scratches in most instances on the surface of the bullet. When I test fire the gun in the laboratory, I fire it into a water tank and I retrieve the bullets that I fired. I can examine those test-fired bullets and demonstrate to myself that I have a pattern of these engravings of the stria on that surface of the bullet. And I can compare, test to test, two bullets that I test fired in the weapon and establish that, in fact, when I fire a bullet from that particular weapon, there is a pattern I can expect to see on that bullet. And so now I know, having done that when I look at a bullet that I don't know what gun it has been fired from, that if I find that pattern on there, then I have the opportunity to draw a connection between the bullet that's been recovered and submitted to the laboratory and possibly the gun that's been submitted to. And that connection is going to be based on the presence of these patterns of markings. With the cartridge casing, they have exactly the same thing going on. And of course, we have different parts of the gun that are involved. I will talk about two because they were involved in my examination in this case. I told you that a part of the gun strikes the cartridge and causes it to fire. It's that primer causes an explosion, and of course, the cartridge goes off and the bullet goes away. That firing pin, that piece of metal in the gun that actually strikes the cartridge, has markings on it that were created during the manufacture of that firing pin. And some of those markings can be transferred to the cartridge casing. Again, I test fired the cartridge casing. I don't know when I test fire the gun, what parts of the weapon may be marking the cartridge casings in a way that will allow me to come to any conclusion about it, or whether there will be any marks there. I examine my test fires. I will examine the firing pin impression, and under magnification, I may see patterns of markings in the firing pin impression. And again, if I do, and can demonstrate that that's occurring with that ammunition on every cartridge casing I fire in there, then I know I have something to look for on cartridge casings that have been recovered in the course of an investigation and maybe tie that into that gun. The other part...
I'm sorry. Could we have a little bit more question and answer to break it up and follow along? The narrative is rather lengthy.
That's a good point.
Very well. We'll develop a little further as we get into some of the opinions you will offer. But I wanted to have you define another term or two for us, if you would. There's a phrase that I'm sure many people have heard on television and elsewhere called lands and grooves. Could you tell us what they are?
These relate to the inner surface or the inside of the barrel of the modern gun. When they manufacture that barrel, they put grooves on the inside surface of the barrel. And additionally, when they put those grooves into that surface of the barrel, they turn the tool that they are using to put the grooves in there and give it a twist. We call, of course, the grooves of the barrel are the grooves. The term that's applied to the area of the barrel between the grooves we call lands, or Lands. Don't know where the term came from, but that historically has been the term applied to that area between the grooves in the barrel of the rifle or of the weapon.
Okay. Your Honor, I think this would be a good place to break for lunch.
All right, members of the jury will take a lunch break at this time. We will resume at 1. I will remind you not to discuss the case at all during the lunch break. You are excused at this time. You may be seated. Counsel, were you going to be prepared to meet in chambers at 1?
Yes, we could do that.
The package that you were expected came in.
Yes.
Very well. We'll see you at 1 then in chambers.
Judge, would it be beneficial to have a quick 5-minute chat right now, perhaps?
Back in chambers.
Yeah.
Okay. Members of the jury, I have been informed that some of you have had questions about whether or not the trial is proceeding on schedule. I discussed the matter with counsel during the break and I have been assured that the trial is proceeding on schedule. And I can also tell you that because of the weather situation today and tomorrow, it's likely that we'll leave early today and we may be, adjourning early tomorrow as well. We'll try to make arrangements to get the bus here a little sooner to accommodate that schedule. At this point, Mr. Fallon, you may resume your direct examination.
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon, sir. I believe we left off with your discussion of lands and grooves. And I just wanted to have one more question on that topic before we move on. And that is, why are there lands and grooves, or how does it come to be that there are lands and grooves in the barrel of the rifle that occurred during manufacturing?
The manufacturers put those in the barrel. And you remember I described how they will turn the tool that creates the grooves in the barrel. Those are there because when the bullet passes through the barrel, it fills the barrel, engages the rifling, and when it leaves the barrel, it is now spinning, and that makes the bullet more stable and makes the gun much more accurate.
Now, I'm going to have Investigator Weir show you some exhibits, sir, as we begin the remainder of your testimony. First of all, I would like Exhibit 247, which I believe it is the rifle. The record should reflect that Investigator Wiegert is handing Exhibit 247 to Mr. Newhouse. And I would ask you, sir, do you recognize that item?
I do.
And what is it for the record, item Exhibit 247?
Exhibit 247 is a .22 caliber Marlin manufactured semi-automatic rifle, actually known as the Glenfield Model 60. And this was the weapon that was submitted to the laboratory in the course of this investigation.
And how is it that you were able to recognize that particular weapon as the one you submitted for your examination?
I mark, or in some cases, with guns in particular, place a sticker on the weapon with the information that associates it with our case number and the date that I opened the box that it came in, and so on. Additionally, I had also, when it was submitted to the laboratory, I had checked it to make sure it wasn't loaded and safe to handle and store in the laboratory before I examined it in the firearms section. I also have a tag on there with that same kind of information on it.
And I see you are holding the exhibit. You are pointing to what appears to be a green tag on the trigger guard.
That's correct.
And that is a tag that you affixed to the weapon upon your receipt of it.
Yes.
All right. I would like to have Investigator Wiegert also show you one other item. Well, two other items. Exhibit 250, the shell casings. Do you have Exhibit 250 in front of you?
I do.
And do you recognize that exhibit?
Yes, I do.
And for the record, what is Exhibit 250?
Exhibit 250 is a paper bag, a box, and eventually you get to 11 fired cartridge casings, all of them .22 caliber cartridge casings.
And are those the casings that were submitted to you for examination and comparison in this case?
They are.
And finally, if Investigator Wiegert would provide you Exhibits 276 and 277, which one are you holding at the moment?
I have Exhibit 277.
All right. And tell us what Exhibit 277 is.
Exhibit 277 is a bullet fragment, if you like, that we designated as item number FL when it was received in the laboratory.
All right. And Exhibit 276?
Exhibit 276 is a second bullet, and this one we designated as item FK when it was received in the laboratory.
All right. Were all these items submitted at the same time, or did they come in at different times?
They came in at different times.
All right. And the result of which, how many reports did you generate regarding your examination of those items?
I wrote 2 reports to describe the conclusions I came to.
All right. Let's take a look, take them one at a time. We'll start with the first report. At approximately when was the first report prepared by you regarding your findings?
The first report that I wrote was written on February the 21st of 2006.
All right. So let's begin then with that report and your examination regarding that report. With respect to that first or initial examination, what were you asked to do?
Well, I knew that we had submitted in the case a rifle that some cartridge casings had also been recovered and submitted. I was asked to examine and test fire the rifle and then to answer the question, determine if I could, whether the cartridge casings that had been recovered had actually been fired in this rifle or whether they had been fired in some other weapon.
All right. All right. Let's begin with the rifle. What was the first thing that you had to do in order to attempt any subsequent comparisons?
The procedure, the approach to a weapon examination is really the same on just about any gun that I look at. Initially, I'm concerned about whether the weapon is safe to fire. I know I'm going to want to do that. I also want to examine the weapon, as I did in this case, and document various features of the weapon that might allow me to identify it later, or that give me some idea of a possible problem with its function if I examine it closely. Additionally, I'm interested in whether or not there might be, in most cases, some other kind of evidence on the weapon. Just depends on whether it's been examined by someone else or not, or whether I'm the first to actually handle it. So in this case, the first thing I did was to go through the weapon. It had already been through the DNA section. I didn't need to be concerned about any materials or substances on the exterior of the weapon. And so I just documented serial number, caliber, make, model, length of the barrel, various physical characteristics of the weapon. One of the other things that I did in my initial examination is to examine the bore of the weapon, to look down the barrel, for 2 reasons. One, I want to know that it's not obstructed. And the only way to do that is to look down there and make sure there is not a bullet caught up somewhere in the middle of the barrel. And the other was to look at the condition of the barrel. That gives me some idea of what I might expect to see when I fire it. And in particular, what condition the bullet that I recover from test firing it might be.
All right. And did you subsequently then test fire that weapon?
I did.
And what determination did you make regarding the weapon's functioning capability?
After I worked my way through the gun, I was satisfied it was working and in safe enough condition to fire. So I went ahead and selected some ammunition from the collection there at the laboratory and actually fired the weapon, recovering cartridge casings and the bullets, and also confirming that the weapon does function as it was designed to function.
All right. And what kind of ammunition did you select for your test firing?
The cartridge casings that had been submitted, the recovered cartridge casings, were manufactured by CCI, one of the companies that makes ammunition. So I fired from my collection 3 CCI cartridge casings. 3 CCI cartridges.
All right. And those cartridges contain the bullets that you previously described in terms of how the weapon operates?
Yes.
All right. And generally, just for our benefit, what is a bullet? What does it consist of? What is in the bullet?
Virtually all bullets are going to be either lead composition or they will be a lead core that's contained within some kind of a copper alloy jacketing. In this case, the bullets that I fired initially in this weapon, particularly for the comparison to and the examination of the cartridge casings that were submitted, were lead bullets.
All right. All right. Now, after you determined that the 22 caliber rifle was functioning properly, what did you do with respect to determining whether any of the cartridge casings had been fired from that rifle?
Well, as I said, I recovered the cartridge casings that I had fired in this weapon. The next step was to compare those to the recovered cartridge casings, those ones that were submitted. And at that moment, or at the point that they were recovered, Of course, we didn't know what gun they were fired in. The examination is a microscopic examination. I'm looking at very, very tiny markings that are placed, as I described earlier, on the cartridge casings by the different parts of the gun. First thing I do is to look at my test fires to again assess what expectations I can have of finding markings that are placed there by the gun, what they look like, what patterns I will see. Having done that, I would then, using my microscope again, place one of the cartridge casings that we were wondering whether it was fired from the gun and one of my test fired cartridge casings on the microscope and do a direct comparison under magnification of those markings that I see on the cartridge casings.
And were you able then to make a determination as to whether the casing submitted to you had in fact been fired from that gun?
Yes, I was.
And what conclusion did you reach?
I was able to determine that all 11 of the cartridge casings that had been submitted had, in fact, been fired in this rifle.
And the opinion that all of them have been fired in that rifle, do you hold that opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
I do.
And your opinion that the weapon, the .22 caliber Marlin Glenfield 60 rifle, was functioning properly upon its submission to you, do you hold that opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, I do.
All right. I would like to direct your attention to the second examination that you prepared in this particular case. I want to direct your attention to May of 2006, where you once again asked to conduct an analysis involving that very same Marlin Glenfield rifle.
Yes, I was.
All right. This time, what was the requested task or examination that was expected?
By now, 2 bullets, 2 pieces of metal that looked like bullets, at any rate at that point, had been recovered. I was asked again to determine, if possible, whether those 2 bullets had been fired from the same weapon that I had already identified the cartridge casings as having been fired from.
All right. And are those previously identified exhibits 277 and 276, which are in front of you?
They are.
All right. And have the crime lab designations item FL and FK, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Let's begin with a closer description, if possible, of the bullet fragments or suspected bullet fragments that you were asked to examine. First of all, let's begin with Exhibit 276, identified as bullet FK. Tell us, if you can, what the condition of that particular fragment was upon its submission for your examination.
Well, the bullet in Exhibit 276, which again is our item FK, is probably or would not be immediately recognizable to most people as a bullet. It's in very poor condition. It doesn't look like it did when it was still in the cartridge.
Your Honor, I object and move to strike that comment as to what other people would think it looked like. He can give an opinion as to its condition, but he can't express an opinion about whether other people would have recognized it.
I think he's talking about its apparent condition. I'm going to overrule the objection.
Thank you. All right. Please describe further the condition of the bullet.
This has been damaged greatly. No longer looks like a bullet. Of course, having looked at these for 35 years, it does look to me like a bullet that has passed through or has struck some harder object than the bullet. When I examine it in the laboratory initially, I do a number of things. I weigh the bullet. I look at it under the microscope to determine what kinds of, or if any, rifling characteristics might be present on what remains of this bullet. I'm also interested in the bullet composition. I want to fire a bullet like that from this gun for comparison. And so I'm interested in whether this is a lead bullet or whether this is a lead bullet that's coated with copper, and so on. And all of those things were part of what I documented and recorded in the course of my examination of this item, State's Exhibit 276.
And what can you tell us about the bullet? You said you wanted to select one that was similar to what had been submitted to you. So I guess my question is, what would you have selected, or not what would you have? What did you select for the purposes of making a comparison?
When I did the microscopic examination, it was clear it was a coated bullet and not a lead bullet. It was also clear it was a .22 caliber bullet to me. Additionally, under the microscope, I could see markings that were put there by the rifle, in particular the barrel through which it was fired. Those lands and grooves that I described earlier in the bullet leave what we refer to as land and groove impressions. And in this particular item, Exhibit 276, I could identify under the microscope 8 remaining land and groove impressions on that bullet.
All right. Was that enough to be able to make any comparisons whatsoever as to whether that bullet was fired from that gun or any other gun for that matter?
The next step was to look at that under greater magnification on the microscope. And the fact is, on this Exhibit 276, although I had 8 of these land and groove impressions remaining on the bullet, under greater magnification, I could see that I had none of the very small detail, those things that make up patterns that I was trying to describe earlier. None of that was present, or at least not enough of it for me to use to come to any conclusion about what gun fired this bullet in Exhibit 276.
All right. Now, I need you to explain something. You previously described the bullets you selected, the CCI bullets, as being lead bullets. And then you just made some comment about not being lead coated, but with a different substance. Can you kind of explain?
Yes.
So that we're not confused here.
Yes. Most .22 caliber bullets, with the exception of .22 magnums, are actually lead bullets. But many of them are coated with a very fine powder of copper or possibly a copper alloy that they actually impress into the surface of the bullet. And that's the kind of bullet that we have here in Exhibit 276. That's important to me because I know that if I'm going to compare this to the test-fired bullet from this gun, I want to shoot the same kind of thing. So I selected then for this second set of examinations with the bullets an ammunition that, in fact, was copper-coated.
All right. Although it was a lead bullet, but the coating was not lead, the coating was copper?
Correct.
Okay. All right. So just so we're clear, were you able to make any comparisons then with respect to bullet FK Exhibit 276?
I was able, or it was limited to a class characteristics comparison, a term I haven't used yet. I knew by examining the bullet in Exhibit 276 that it had been fired from a gun manufactured with 16 lands and grooves and a right-hand twist. That much information is on the bullet. It's also a .22 caliber bullet. This weapon is a .22 caliber bullet. And in the barrel of this gun are 16 lands and grooves and a right-hand twist. However, I can say no more than that about this bullet. And the fact of the matter is, I cannot specify exactly what gun this bullet was fired in, again, because I don't have those small stria, those scratches on the bullet surface that I can use for that kind of conclusion.
All right. So in terms of class characteristics, is that a general category or a specific category? Or tell us. I'm not a gun person, so what should I take from that?
It means that based just on the class characteristics on Exhibit 276, I know it was fired in some gun, among a group of guns, thousands of guns, if you like, tens of thousands of guns that were manufactured with 16 lands and grooves and a right-hand twist, and were .22 caliber. And I can be no more specific than that, based on what we have left on this bullet.
All right. And do you hold that opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
I do.
All right. Let's direct our attention then to the remaining bullet, item FL, exhibit number 277. Were you able to conduct an analysis of that particular bullet?
I did.
And were you able to make a determination as to whether exhibit 277, bullet designation FL, was fired from the Marlin Glenfield .22 caliber rifle in front of you?
Yes, I was.
And what conclusion were you able to reach?
In this case, I was able to be more specific and, in fact, because of markings on the bullet in State's Exhibit 277, I was able to conclude that this bullet had been fired from this specific gun.
All right. So Exhibit 277 had been fired from Exhibit 247.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Now, how is it that you were able to make that determination?
Again, we have to refer to or talk about what's present at high magnification on the surface of that bullet. And on this bullet I have, in fact, patterns of scratches or patterns of stria present on a number of different areas of the bullet, even in the condition it's in, that I could relate to, that I could identify with the same patterns on the test-fired bullet. Furthermore, the patterns that were there, the markings that I see, are patterns that I recognize as being more than could be expected to be seen, more than we could ever see on a bullet that was not fired from the same gun. It has to exceed what I recognize as those set of markings that we expect to see on two bullets not fired from the same gun. So when I looked at State's Exhibit 277, the pattern I saw there, the quality and quantity of the pattern correlations and matchings that I saw there was enough for me to come to a conclusion that, in fact, the reason they had the same pattern on this bullet and my test-fired bullets is because it had been fired from the same gun.
All right. Does that mean it could not have been fired from any other gun?
It does.
The opinion that Exhibit 277, item designation FL, was fired from Exhibit 247, the Marlin Glenfield 60 22 caliber rifle. Do you hold that opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
I do.
The opinion that it could not have been fired from any other gun, do you hold that opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
I do.
Did you prepare two brief reports on a disc summarizing your findings?
The findings with regard to the bullets was on a report dated May 10th of 2006. I also had taken photographs of some of what I saw under the microscope and had those transferred to a disc.
All right. For the record, Your Honor, counsel has seen them. I have had the two reports marked and a disc marked to complete the testimony, but offer them into evidence and tender the witness for cross-examination.
Any objection?
No objection.
All right. The exhibits are received.
Give us the numbers, please.
Certainly, 418, 419, 417, the disc.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Let me go back a little bit and maybe have you explain to the jury in a little bit more details a few things, okay?
Certainly.
About your field. Now, one thing, sir, you are a little bit far from the microphone. If you would pull it forward to you or pull your chair up or maybe lean forward, I think that would probably help.
Okay.
That's much better. Thank you. You say you belong to this organization for 20 years now, the Association of Firearms and Tool Marks Examiners. Is that right?
Probably more than that, but at least 20 years.
Oh, okay. And that's a reputable organization. It's been around a long time.
Yes, it has.
And if you've been a member that long, I assume you've kept up with, do you get sort of a regularly monthly publication?
Yes, we do.
Do you get the AFTE journal?
It's a quarterly journal, but yes, I do.
Okay, and that's a journal that is where articles are published. People in your field share studies and information with other people, such as yourself.
That's correct.
And I take it that to belong to that organization, there's certain guidelines or qualifications you have to have.
Yes, there are.
It's not just pay your money and you're in, right?
No.
Okay, and you abide by those guidelines and qualifications, right?
I had to satisfy them to become a member, yes.
Right, and you continue to abide by whatever requirements are recommended or the recommendations of that organization, right?
Beyond maintaining the work that I do in the field and then paying the fee every year, there are no other requirements to receive the journal.
Okay, but you do read the literature.
Yes, I do.
All right, And you also said that your lab, the crime lab, is a member of ASCLD. That's ASCLD, often referred to by people like you as ASCLD.
I don't think I said that, but we are ASCLD lab accredited.
I thought you did say that actually, but I might be wrong.
Nope.
And is that true of the entire crime lab? All the different units are ASCLD qualified?
No.
Your unit, though, is ASCLD accredited, right?
Yes, it is.
And in order to become accredited by that organization, which again, we had some testimony about it, but that's a different witness. That's actually an association of crime lab directors, right?
Yes.
And they do a number of different things in terms of reviewing the procedures and qualifications of the people in the lab, whatever unit they're accrediting before they give out that accreditation, right?
That's correct.
And that includes they review your protocols for tests and examinations, right?
Yes, I do.
And proficiency tests as well.
Yes.
Do you do proficiency tests?
Yes, I do.
What sort of proficiency tests does a firearm and toolmark person do?
We do probably 2 a year. One of them will be a firearms case, maybe a set of bullets that we have to determine were fired from the same gun, or maybe cartridge casings. We are also asked once a year to do a proficiency test that's focused on more specific tool mark kind of comparison. Might be a bow cutter case, might be a mark made by a screwdriver.
Okay, so it's not just bullets, it's also other tool markings.
Yes.
And then you also have a protocol for different types of examinations that you do.
We have procedures in place that relate to how we perform certain examinations.
Okay, and one of the things that ASCLD requires, and I believe the other association, the AFTE, is that you make sure that you have proper documentation of what you examine, right?
That's correct.
That can include notes, right?
Yes.
Photographs?
Yes.
And peer review, right?
That's correct. That's an element of our examination process, yes.
Okay, and in fact, the guidelines, I believe, require that your documentation be good enough that another person in your absence can look at it and come to the same conclusions, right?
That's correct.
And when you do these examines, you are supposed to have two people look at it. You look at it, come to a conclusion, and then you have another person look at it up here and come to the same conclusion.
That's correct.
And that's part of your protocol.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Now, when we talked about proficiency tests, you are aware, I assume, of a gentleman by the name of Alfred Biasotti?
Yes, I am.
You probably have been questioned about this gentleman before, haven't you?
Not specifically that I recall, no.
Okay, then I'll be the first. He produced a very well-known study in your field, correct?
Yes, he did.
And forgive me for a moment while I get the actual name of it. It's called a statistical study of the individual characteristics of fired bullets. Does that sound right?
Yes, it does.
Actually, that was a study done quite some time ago, in 1959, but still is relied on in your field.
Yes.
All right. And what he concluded is that, among other things, that in the real world, there's no such thing as a perfect match when it comes to cartridges and bullets, correct?
That's correct. If by that you mean everything lines up, yes.
Right. And in his study, actually his study echoed the findings of another study that found only 21 to 38% of the marks will match up on bullets fired from the very same gun. Does that sound right?
That sounds like an appropriate range if we're talking about percent match.
Okay, so that when you're looking at those bullets and you're calling something a match, you're doing so with 21 to 38% of those markings matching up.
If, in fact, on the particular bullets I'm looking at, That may be the case that if we look at percent matching, that may be that only 21% match.
All right. And yet you could still call it a match.
That's correct.
Now, part of that is because in your field, your opinion is really what we would call subjective, correct?
There are subjective elements to it. There are objective qualities to the examinations and conclusions as well.
Well, let me just give you an example. You mentioned in this case there were bullets with 16 lands and grooves. The rifle, you believe, had 16 lands and grooves, right?
That's correct.
There's no magic number when you're looking at a bullet that says you have to have 14. You have to see 14 of those match up in order to call it a match, right?
No, the number of actual groove impressions or land impressions that remain on a bullet that we're examining does not have to be a certain number of the original number that were there.
Okay, so you're probably a little bit familiar with fingerprints, for instance, right?
Not really too much. In terms of identification, no.
Okay, so you're not aware of how many standards they have about how many points of similarity have to match up before they can make a call.
I'm aware that they have, or that some agencies operate under the need or requirement to have a certain number of points.
Okay, but in your field, there is no quantitative number or guidelines that you have to follow before you call something a match or not a match.
There is no required guideline. There are guidelines established that have been published in the literature of that same journal we have been talking about.
Okay, but it's not something that you follow.
No, that's not true.
Well, it's something that do you have a specific number that you have to get to in terms of number of lands and grooves before you can call something a match?
I have a certain number of matching stria. I'm going to have to use terminology I haven't defined yet.
We'll define stria a little bit more later, but just tell me what it is. What is it? You have a specific number?
Again, there's nothing regarding how many land and groove impressions must be on a bullet. The only requirement is that we have a pattern of markings on the bullet or the cartridge casing, and that they satisfy some kind of minimum requirement.
But the minimum requirement is a subjective requirement. It's your opinion that there's enough to call a match, right?
No, that's not correct.
Is there a specific number you must have, 40 particular stria in order to call it, or what?
There are, and in fact, Mr. Biochemistry, in that treatise that you named a moment ago, there are a certain number of stria that have been identified and that we recognize as a number, beyond which we know we will not see that amount of correlation in a non-matched type of comparison. That's going to require a little explanation probably, but the point of what I'm trying to say is that Mr. Biochemistry, in fact, with that paper, was the one who first defined it. That there are, and we can talk about minimum criteria of consecutive matching stria or markings and treat that as a threshold above which we can be sure statistically that this is an identification.
Well, tell us, what is the minimum? What's the number? Is there a number associated with the minimum?
Yes, there is.
What is it?
When we're talking about a three-dimensional stria comparison, if you look under the microscope, the markings I'm looking at, as I alluded to earlier, I think are not just scratches. They actually have depth. They have width. They have that three-dimensional element to it. So we're not just counting lines. When I'm performing this kind of a comparison, the all-important question is, of course, when do I know I have enough for an identification? Mr. Biochemisty's research, followed up by any number of other 3 or 4 other important papers over the last few years, have defined that minimum criteria, and it's available for examiners to use if they wish to rely on it. In response, what the actual number is, when I'm looking at three-dimensional patterns of marks on bullets, or any tool mark for that matter, and we're talking about stria, that if I have two consecutive groups of 3 marks or a single run of consecutive markings that number 6, or more than that, of course, this is a minimum conservative criteria again. Then I can be assured, again, based on these studies that have been published in the AFTE journal, and that all of these researchers have completed, I can be assured that, in fact, that is not possible with 2 bullets fired from 2 different guns. When I see that minimum criteria or one more, I can be assured, based solely on that those 2 bullets have to have been fired from the same gun in order to observe that set of matching stria.
All right. Let me, jumping around a little bit here, but as long as we're on this topic, tell us, what was the number you found for item FL in this case?
If we look at item FL and we look at the photographs, a little more specifically later, if you want to, you will see one run on, I believe it was a groove impression number 3 of of 6 consecutive stria. What I was trying to remember was whether they were actually 7 or not. But at any rate, we have at least 6 consecutive stria. And again, that is the minimum criteria that would allow me, based solely on what I'm seeing in that one groove impression, to come to the conclusion that it was fired from this particular gun.
And you are starting that from your and you're stating that from your memory, is that right?
Well, I have reviewed my case notes and my photographs.
Okay, I'm going to show you Exhibit 420. If you could identify that for us, please.
Exhibit 420 is a worksheet that I use to document the cartridge casings, or my examination of the cartridge casings.
And that worksheet has information that you fill out. It's sort of a graph, or actually more like a chart, and it's where you make a note of a number of things, right?
That's correct.
And nowhere on this document do you indicate anywhere what you just testified to the jury, is it?
That's correct.
What it does say, though, is this particular worksheet includes both. Well, let's put it up on the Elmo. You can see it from the screen, I believe, from where you're sitting. Actually, I marked the wrong exhibit. Let me give you another one. Just to clarify for the jury here, look at Exhibit 425 for a minute.
Okay.
You said you did this on 2 different dates?
That's correct.
On one date, you did the cartridges. The first one I gave you actually was the worksheet for the cartridges.
Cartridge casings, yes.
So let me direct your attention now to 425 instead, which is the worksheet from the bullets, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, let's put that up. All right, we've got Exhibit 425 up on the screen. Let me zoom out a little bit so we can see the whole thing. And at the top, there's a chart that you fill out that includes some numerical types of information, right?
Some of it are measurements of the bullets that I made, yes.
Okay, and this includes both item FL and FK, right?
Yes, it does.
And for both of them, you indicate 22 caliber. Is that right? Is that what that says?
Yes.
It doesn't say 22 caliber long either, does it?
No.
There's a difference, right?
The dimension that you see there, the 22 inch, is approximately the diameter of the bullet.
Okay. Doesn't tell you whether it's a 22 caliber long, 22 caliber short, or plain old 22 caliber, does it?
Just tells me it's a plain old 22 caliber, and just that measurement does not allow me to conclude whether it's a 22 long, short, long rifle.
Well, in this particular instance, with FL and FK, were you able to conclude from looking at the bullet alone whether this was a 22 caliber long, short, or plain old 22 caliber?
Are we talking about FL or FK? I'm sorry.
Let's look at FL.
Okay. FL The other characteristic of the bullet that might allow me to determine and distinguish a long from a long rifle and from a short is the weight of the bullet. The weight of the bullet there is 19.7 grains. And the weight of the bullet when...
We're talking about this column right here, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
The weight of a long rifle bullet is generally around, it's 40 grains. There's a few variations in that out there the manufacturers have produced. A .22 short bullet, I honestly don't recall what the weight of those are, but they are much less than that, than 40 grains. The 19.7 grains is clearly because of the condition of the bullet, which I also observed. I recognize I'm missing parts of the bullet. And so I don't see that 40 grain weight that you would expect from a .22 long rifle.
Well, but you don't know what you've got, whether it's a .22 long or not, so you don't really know what the weight is supposed to be.
Based on the weight, no, I don't know.
So there's really nothing you can tell from this bullet whether this is a .22 long or not, right?
Well, that's not true. I know it's not a .22 short because if I had 20 grains of a .22 short bullet, I would have more of the bullet.
Okay.
Than I have.
Fair enough. But you can tell the difference between a long and a short just from this bullet.
The difference between a long rifle and a long and a short, or a long rifle and a short.
Right.
There's two different things. I can't tell the difference between a long rifle and a long. I can tell the difference here between a long rifle and a short, and a long and a short.
All right. Well, let's not get bogged down on that. As long as you talked about the weight, let's talk about that. If it is a long .22 long caliber, a full bullet would be about 40 grains, right?
Again, I don't recall the weight on a .22 long. A .22 long rifle is 40 grains.
Okay. And in this instance, then, item FL would be only about half of that, correct?
That's correct.
And item FK is actually about 3/4 of it, right?
Yes, it is.
So item FK is actually a larger fragment than FL.
More of the original bullet is present in FK.
Okay. Now, third column over is TWT means twist. It's a right-hand twist, both of them, right?
Yes.
The next one is lands and grooves, and it says 11 of 16 for the first one and 8 of 16 for the second one, right?
11 remaining and 16 original and 8 remaining, yes.
Okay. All right. And then over by the grains, it says coated. That explains that particular type, right?
Yes.
And in the base construction, concave coated for both, right?
Yes.
And I can't read that last column. What is that?
That's an indication that I marked the container in which the bullet was received, but I did not mark the bullet.
Okay, just a container. And then down below, you have some handwritten notes. First part is packaging, fairly routine. And then below that, you have got FL. It says no markings in the land impression, correct?
Correct.
That means the land portion of the barrel is making no impressions on this particular bullet that you can tell.
It means that on this bullet, I have no markings in the impression made by the land.
Fine. So you're left with just the grooves, and you do have useful markings in the groove impression, test to test comparisons typical of coated .22 caliber bullets, right?
Yes.
But again, nothing in this document records any kind of minimum number that you testified about earlier.
That's right.
And the determination, let's get back to that for a moment. The whole determination of whether you are seeing these little scratches or stria or you're not it requires a subjective eyeball opinion, right?
Certainly requires an evaluation of what's present there and the judgment about what that means, yes.
And you are looking at these like is this a comparison microscope with two fields?
Yes, it is.
So you've got a test bullet in one and the evidence bullet in the other.
That's correct.
And then you're looking through this microscope and you're making an eyeball comparison based on your judgment, experience, and whatnot, right?
Exactly.
Sort of like used to be done with hair comparison, microscopic analysis. Are you familiar with that?
Objection, no foundation, argumentative, and speculation.
Well, are you familiar with that field?
Can we have a ruling on the objection before counsel starts asking more questions?
Well, I'm going to sustain the objection. I will let him ask the next question, if he is familiar with it.
I meant to withdraw and rephrase, is what I was trying to do. Are you familiar with the field of hair comparison, microscopic analysis?
Familiar is one thing. I have no expertise in hair comparison.
I understand, but you are aware, you've been in crime labs for 30 years, right?
Yes, I have.
And you are aware that that was a field, forensic field, that was offered by crime labs for many years, right?
It was a comparison or examination that was performed for a long time, yes.
And it is no longer, right?
I'm satisfied that some laboratories are probably still performing hair comparisons.
It's been discredited, however.
Objection.
If you know.
Certain elements, certain conclusions that are based on a hair examination certainly are discredited.
All right.
Hair examination itself, done properly, interpreted correctly, has not been discredited.
To your knowledge. But you are not an expert in that field, right?
I'm not an expert in that field.
So this eyeball comparison that you're making, this judgment, just so we're clear, a difference between objective and subjective, let's use some other types of tests that your crime lab does. DNA, for instance. Would you agree that DNA is a more objective test than yours?
No, I would not.
All right. You are aware that DNA, though, the test that comes up with specific numbers and genetic markers, and it either matches or it doesn't, right?
They produce statistics that give them probabilities.
But before you even get to that, they have to determine whether something is completely excluded, whether it just can't be, it doesn't match, right?
Your Honor, I'm going to interpose an objection again. The witness is not trained in DNA. There is no foundation for these questions.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Is it your opinion that your field of forensics is just as objective as DNA? Is that your opinion?
Objection, same objection.
Without more foundation, I agree. The objection is sustained.
Beyond this minimum number or description that you have given us, there's no particular number at which a perfect match can be declared. Is that right?
I would never declare a perfect match because I have never seen one, and I don't need more than the minimum criteria that have been specified in the research and the literature that's been published.
And is that a specific written protocol of your department in the lab?
Absolutely not.
There is no protocol on how to, or what's required in order to make a match, is there?
That is not described in our procedures, no.
What is described is that you have to document whatever it is that you're examining, right?
We're required to document our comparisons. I do that with photography.
Okay. And you always make sure there is another person who looks at the same thing. So it's a peer review.
That's correct.
Okay. Going back just a minute to some of the basics of your field. This kind of testimony or this kind of analysis has been going on for many years, early in the 19th century or something like that, right?
Mid to late 19th century, I believe.
And originally, one of the bases for it was that at the time, firearms were hand forged or homemade by and large, right?
Many of them were, certainly. Certainly, all of them were at the beginning.
Sure. And by doing that handmade process, there were many more unique kind of markings, scratches, features inside of a rifle barrel at that time, right?
Probably not correct, no.
Well, all right. Would you agree with me that modern manufacturing of guns has made guns more uniform from one particular gun off the line than to the next? Same manufacturer?
No, that's not true.
Okay.
In terms of what I'm looking for, in terms of what I'm looking at for identification, no.
Well, let's just talk about the lands and the grooves for a minute, all right? The way a barrel is made these days, most often is it's cast.
No.
Is it forged?
Forging would be part of the process of creating the metal blank that's used to create the barrel.
Okay.
Forging has nothing to do with the inside of the barrel and the process that creates the lands and grooves inside that barrel.
But the process that drills the barrel open, hollow, is a mechanical process.
Yes, it is.
And it's done by a machine, that same machine that makes rifle number 1 that's coming down the line, rifle number 2 that's coming down the line, and so forth, right?
You will have the same tool used to make many barrels.
Okay.
You will have the same tool used to put the grooves and the lands in many barrels.
All right. So there are actually 2 tools. One that hollows out the tube, and then it deliberately, it's put through another machine that deliberately puts these grooves with a twist in it.
That's correct.
And the twist is done in order to deliberately make the bullet spin as it's fired, right?
Yes.
And sometimes the more it spins, the more accurate it can be to its target.
Yes.
Okay. The Marlin 60, would you agree is close to the most popular .22 made in the world?
I don't know any sales figures or anything. I see a lot of them and suggest to me that it's very popular.
Well, you have data banks and databases that you rely on, right?
For some things, yes.
Okay, and from that, I assume you learned something about the rifle that you're examining and testing, right?
Yes.
You're aware that the Marlin 60 has been made since 1960, right?
I don't think I knew when they started making it.
Okay, but it's been around for decades. Would you agree with that?
It has.
And it's mass produced by Marlin, and it's considered a very accurate rifle.
I believe it would be, yes.
Partly because it has those 16 lands and grooves with the twist. Some rifles have much less, right?
Yes.
And so for that reason, plus the fact that it's relatively inexpensive, it's quite common. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
Did you examine any other Marlin 60 firearms for this case?
I did not.
I'm going to read for you a statement from the AFTE Journal, the organization that you belong with. And you tell me if you agree or disagree with this particular statement. Quote, currently, the interpretation of individualization identification is subjective in nature, founded on scientific principles and based on examiners' training and experience.
That's correct.
Okay, let me go back for just 1 minute. When you talked about class, whether something is part of the same class, which is what you concluded the FK was, right?
Yes.
There's really sort of 3 different levels that you could come up with in similarity between bullets that would be class, subclass, or individual characteristics.
Yes.
So that when a rifle comes from the same class, and certainly any Marlin 60 is the same class, would you agree?
Assuming that Marlin manufactured all Marlin 60s with 16 lands, grooves, and right-hand twists, yes.
Okay, so that would make this item FK could have been fired by any Marlin 60.
Based on what remains on that bullet, yes.
And as you candidly admitted, there are at least tens of thousands, if not millions, have been made over the years.
I suspect not millions, but certainly tens of thousands.
Okay, and then the next more unique kind of feature that you could find is called subclass features, right?
Yes.
And then even more unique or supposedly unique than that would be these individual characteristics.
That's correct.
By the way, do you know how many other, if any, firearms are manufactured with 16 lands and grooves and a right-hand twist?
I'm familiar with one other, a .22 caliber pistol manufactured by Jennings. They're no longer in business, but they manufactured some .22 caliber pistols with 16 lands and grooves and a right-hand twist. And there may be others as well.
And item FK, is that the sort of ammunition that could also have been fired in a Jennings .22 caliber or not?
Yes, it is.
So when you talk about class of possible firearms for that bullet, you have to include not just Marlin, but this whole however many number of Jennings there are, right?
That's correct.
Okay. All right, now let me just go for a minute to the cartridges. I'm going to show you what's been marked as, these are exhibits 424, 21, 22, 23, and 24. Can you identify these?
Excuse me, Counsel, are those cartridge photos?
Yes, those are all the cartridge, I believe.
These are copies of photographs that I took of the cartridge comparisons.
Okay, some of them are, I'm going to put one or two of these up on the screen. Some of them are just photographs of the cartridge itself, unfired, and others of one of these comparisons having one side one and one side the other, right?
3 of them are comparisons of the test fire to one of the cartridges submitted. And the 4th picture is a photograph of the head of one of the cartridges submitted.
Let's start with that last one first, since I'll go ahead and leave the photocopies up here with you so you can refer to them as numbers. That's 421?
I'm sorry? Yes, it is.
And that's just a close-up of a photograph of the cartridge before it's fired.
No.
After it's fired?
This is a photograph of, as I indicate there on the bottom, one of the cartridge casings from what we refer to as item EI and is in States Exhibit 250. I took a picture of it just to illustrate what we see when a cartridge casing has been fired. That indentation you see, the rectangular one at 3 o'clock, I guess.
Sure.
Is the firing pin impression that was created by the gun that fired that cartridge casing.
Okay, and so that little rectangular thing at 3 o'clock is a very distinctive marking that apparently occurred when these shells were fired.
That's correct.
And this is one of the shells, 11 shells that was given you in that box, right?
Yes.
Okay, I don't want to belabor this too much, but let's look at Exhibit 424. Is that one of these where you made a comparison side by side?
Yes, it is.
So in this one, you can kind of see the line down the middle, and you've got numbers or lettering at the bottom that says test fire from item DD.
That's correct.
And that shows a very close match, even to the unaided, to the layperson. One can see that this marking over on the right side of the picture matches up very nicely with the one on the left, which is the shell that was found in item EI, right?
Counsel, which exhibit is this now?
424.
Thank you.
I hope it's clear. From here, to me, it's not real clear, but I will use the pointer. The dividing line, that is, what separates the image of my test fire cartridge casing from one of the cartridge casings in Exhibit 250, here is really, in the photograph, a discontinuity from the distance you are at. If you could see it more closely, you would see there's a very fine dark line there. On the right side of that line is the image of the test fire. On the left side, the image of one of these cartridge casings. The area of interest runs from approximately where the pointer is now up to here. And yes, along that line, there is what appears to me, of course, to be a very clear correlation or agreement of detail that was created by the firing pin of the rifle, the Marlin Glenfield 60 rifle.
That's fine. And that's fairly easy, I think, even for myself and the jury to be able to see that similarity. I want to show you now. Did I mark the other ones? Do you have any bullet ones up there too?
Yes, I do.
Are they marked?
No.
All right, thanks. I'm showing you exhibits 426, 7, and 8. Can you identify those?
Exhibits 426, 427, and 428, these are all copies of, again, photographs that I took of markings in this case that I observed during the bullet comparison, and specifically of the bullet in item 277, compared to the test fires from the Glenfield Model 60.
All right. I'm going to put one of them up on the screen, and you're going to have to tell us what number it is on your...
That's number 426.
All right. Now, again, this is one of those split screen ones. The one on the right is the test fire bullet, and the one on the left is the item FL, right?
Yes.
This is only one portion of the cylindrical kind of bullet, at any rate, that you're looking at, right?
Just a portion of what's remaining on that bullet.
Okay, but it's a fragment, right?
Very small portion of it, yes.
Excuse me, counsel. Could we have the witness, now that we have put that up on the screen, identify which photograph goes with that?
He did, 426. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. You've got the pointer. You've got the pointer. I don't. So I'm just going to point. Would it be fair to say that the indentation, linear areas of this on either side of this is what you can call the groove?
What you just pointed to? Here, let me use the pointer. This area here that you see defined by two parallel lines, and this area here, which is clearly defined by two parallel lines on this side, but less obviously so here, those are the land impressions as they were created by the lands in the barrel.
I see. It's the reverse here because these are impressions.
Right.
So on the barrel, these would actually, the flatter surfaces on the bullet is what actually is the groove in the barrel. Is that right?
Well, they aren't really flat, but on the bullet they are raised. And they are raised because they are impressions of the groove in the barrel of the weapon.
And as I recall, your notes said that the grooves don't give us any particular information in this case. Is that what you said?
I said the land impressions don't have any detail.
Okay. And the land ones, again, are which ones?
You see in the photograph the label GI number 1, and that refers to groove impression number 1. I labeled this one number 1. The land impressions are this area and this area on each side of the groove impressions.
In any event, the test fire bullet on the right shows quite a bit of difference in the land area from the one on the left. So, does it not? I mean, it seems to have some extra ridges or bulges sticking out of some sort.
There are differences between both bullets. I don't know what you're referring to specifically. There's a great deal of differences on the bullet on the left side of the photograph when you compare it to the bullet on the right side of the photograph.
a great deal of difference, right?
Absolutely, yes.
And yet you're saying that this bullet on the right, which was fired from the gun that you had in front of you earlier, is a match with the bullet on the left, the fragment, despite the great deal of differences. Is that right?
I'm saying there's enough detail there, and not in this position in in that photograph, but in the composite of positions that some of which we see exhibited in other photographs, for me to conclude that yes, that bullet in my FL Exhibit 277 was fired from that Marlin rifle.
And in doing that, you have to discount the differences that you find on the bullet from the test fire.
I have to understand them, yes.
All right, let's go to the next one. And can you tell us which exhibit that is?
Oh, your number is 427.
Okay, 427 is on the screen. Again, we see, show us the line on this one from the microscope from one to the next.
It runs here. See the discontinuity? Particularly in this area right here, you see the different colors?
Right.
That's the dividing line that separates the image of the bullet in 277 from my test-fired bullet.
And your test-fired bullet, also there's another vertical line running down the line of it, the center of it, right?
Yes, that's right.
And that's not the microscope line, that's on the bullet.
That's a design feature of the bullet that remained intact after firing it.
That's not a designed feature that's on the item FL.
No.
And again, we see these multiple raised bumps, I call them, on the right in the test fire, but we don't see them on FL. Is that right?
Are you talking about these?
Yes.
Okay. Those are called cannelures, and you are right. They are not in that photograph present on the bullet in Exhibit 277.
All right. And finally, this is, I think, the last photograph that you took comparing item FL with the test fire bullet. And here, it looks like the bullet itself is damaged. The item FL appears to be significantly damaged in that area.
We're at the edge of the useful part of item or Exhibit 277, our item FL bullet. And above that area, you see that it is impacted and just been completely obliterated by the impact it made with whatever it struck.
Maybe for my benefit, again, tell me what those bumps are again. Cannelures?
Over here, again, on the test fire bullet, I have two sets of cannelures.
Would you spell those for the court reporter?
Sure. Cannelures.
Okay. And on this one, the test fire bullet has two sets of those visible.
This is the same test fire bullet we were looking at before, but yes, in this photograph, there are two sets of them visible.
And again, they are not at all visible on any of the three photographs that you took of item FL.
No, they are not.
By the way, while I'm thinking of it, do you have your CV up there? I'm item or exhibit 416?
Yes, I do.
Is there a typo on here? Third from the bottom, 1978 to 1989, California Department of Justice. The one right above it says 1981. You weren't working at both the California Department of Justice and should that be 1979?
There's clearly a typographical error there.
And what is it supposed to be? 1979?
Should be, yes, 19. That refers to my last 2 years there, 1978. And it should have been should have gone to 1980, actually. I don't know why it says 1989. Because in 1981 is when I joined the Montana State Crime Laboratory.
And did you go right from one job to the next, or were you off work for a while?
No, I left the California laboratory, I think in May of 1980. And I had opened a business with an acquaintance there in Sacramento that eventually didn't work out. and chose then to take the position in Montana in January of 1981.
So by the time you left the California Department of Justice, you had risen to the level of section supervisor, right?
Criminalist 3, yes. I functioned as section supervisor, yes.
But then in your next job, you actually went sort of down the ladder when you started in Montana as just a plain old examiner, right?
They simply classified them differently.
You weren't a section supervisor at Montana?
I was the only examiner there.
Oh, okay.
No one to supervise.
Okay. And then from there, you went to Kansas City in 1988, right?
That's correct.
This is now the third different organization you have worked for, right?
At that time, yes.
And when you left there, you were considered chief criminalist of the toolmark section, right?
I had, the last 2 years there, I had assumed the supervisorial position there, which is that of chief criminalist, yes.
Again, there must be a typo because it says 7/2002, and then it says Wisconsin starts in 2000. Which is it?
Well, no. When I left the laboratory there, I left myself a month and a half or 2 months in between before I actually started here.
And you didn't start here as chief head of the Firearms toolmark section, did you?
Again, I'm the only examiner in the Firearms section in the Madison laboratory. My title, I think, is that of unit leader for what it's worth.
You're the only firearm examiner?
In the Madison laboratory, yes.
Well, how do you ever have anybody review your work?
I do that using photographs. And one of the examiners in the Milwaukee laboratory, another of the Wisconsin state laboratories, of course, reviews my photographs. And on occasion, I will take cases over to him where I believe it's warranted or where he does. And that's how we conduct our peer review of the examinations.
That's how you comply with that part of your protocol that says you always have an examiner, 2 examiners look at the same thing, right?
Exactly.
Okay, I will use the Elmo for just a minute now. And when you do that, when you have the peer review, you actually have, I'll just use this example, 422. Put down PC2. You've got 2 signatures. You've got, is this the person in Milwaukee who signed off on this?
Yes, it is.
And what's his name?
Reg Templin.
So the first initials on 2/21/06 is yourself, right?
Yes.
And the next one below is on 4/13/06 is Reginald Templin, Templin.
Excuse me. Yes.
And this is the one of the cartridge fires, test fires.
Yes, it is.
Okay, again, same thing with, this is another cartridge fire, this being exhibit 424, also initialed by yourself and Mr. Templin, right?
423, that's correct.
And exhibit 424, which is another cartridge fire, same initials. I can't tell if it's the same date that Mr. Templin signed. Looks like that might be a 4/13/06.
Yes.
Okay, now the last one from the cartridge casing, again, peer reviewed, signed by both yourself and Mr. Templin, right?
Yes.
Now let's go to the photograph for exhibit 426. Those your initials on it, dated 5/10/06.
Yes.
Do you see Mr. Templin's initials anywhere on there?
No, they're not there.
Is there anybody besides Mr. Templin who ever reviews your work?
Occasionally, but not in this case, no.
Okay, this, by the way, is bullet item FL, right?
Yes, it is.
Let's look at 427, another photograph, one of the ones we looked at on the screen. Again, item FL. Those your initials?
Yes, they are.
Same date, 5/10/06.
Yes,
Do you see Mr. Templin's initials anywhere on here?
they are not there.
Do you see any other firearm tool examiner's initials anywhere on here?
No, Mr. Templin is the one who reviewed that one. There wouldn't be anyone else.
Do you see item 428?
Yes,
Also another one for item FL. Do you see your initials on there?
yes, they are.
Do you see Mr. Templin's initials on there?
No, they are not.
So we have in your documentation that you must keep in order to maintain your protocol, no record that any other examiner besides yourself looked at item FL to confirm whether your opinion that this bullet was fired from the gun that was before you earlier were one in the same, came from the same gun, right?
The error here is that that's not where he makes or records his approval. His acknowledgement that he reviewed the identification via the pictures.
Well, sir, we saw how he made very diligent initials when he reviewed your opinions, your subjective opinion about the cartridges, right?
Objection to the characterization, subjective.
He's giving us that. Certainly subjective. I'll rephrase it.
Okay.
On each and every one of the photographs that you took of the cartridge, of your opinion about the cartridges, Mr. Templin signed his initials, did he not?
Not at the time he reviewed the photographs.
Well, they are on these documents, right?
That's correct.
Do you have any documents in that file that show the very exhibits we just showed, the photographs with Mr. Templin's name or initials for item FL?
No, because he had not reviewed the printed copy. He reviewed the computer stored copy.
Do you have any documentation anywhere in your file that establishes anyone else reviewed your opinion that item FL was fired from the gun that was before you?
That documentation is not in the file.
Nowhere in your file.
That's correct.
And so that would be a deviation from your protocol, wouldn't it?
No.
The protocol requires documentation. You told us, right?
Yes.
And documentation including peer review, right?
Correct.
And yet on this very same bullet, item FL that we have heard a lot of testimony about, once again, we have something that indicates a deviation from your protocol. Is that right?
Argumentative mischaracterization.
Well, I'm going to allow him to explain his answer. Why do you feel it's not a deviation?
The protocol and the approval method that we use for peer review involves my taking those pictures that you saw, some of which you saw up there. I copy them to a location on our server in our computer network that is secure, of course, that Reg Templin in Milwaukee has access to. Then I email him. I let him know that, in fact, I have a case there that needs to be reviewed before I can then send a report out or write the report expressing my opinions. He reviews those photographs. If he agrees that those photographs that we've been looking at to him support my opinion that that bullet was fired from that gun or that the cartridge casing was fired from that gun, he then records with the computer that A, he has reviewed it, and B, he has approved it. And that then is the record of the peer review. The initials that you see on the paperwork, which are in our file at the laboratory in Madison, of course, reflects the other part of the procedure, and it is part of the review process, but different from the peer review of my identifications. Once or twice a year, it's entirely up to what Reg and I work out. He comes over to Madison, he has to review a certain percentage, approximately 20%, of all the cases I have done since he was there last. And this case, the cartridge casing examinations, because I did them first before he came in April, was one of those case files that he reviewed. As part of the procedure to prove that he's reviewed the case file, he initials all the paperwork there, all the supporting documentation that I put in the case file. And that's why we see this April 13 date on some of those documents. And that's because he came over in April. But the bullet examinations was actually performed in May.
Okay, I think we understand what you're saying. It's now March 1st, 10 months later from the item FL opinions that you came to, right? And you said that you see Mr. Templin twice a year. So presumably you've seen him since April of 2003, right? 06, I'm sorry. April of 06, correct?
That's correct.
Despite that, Mr. Templin has never signed off on any of those exhibits we showed of the photographs that comprise your opinion about item FL. Isn't that right?
Objection, mischaracterization. That's not what the witness testified to. He explained the process. This is asked and answered.
No, it's not.
I'm sensing there might be a misunderstanding here between the questioner and the witness. Explain again.
I understand what he's saying. Of the 20%, are you saying he has reviewed 20% of your cases since April of 06?
Yes.
Okay, and you're telling us that it just so happens that of the files that he reviewed during that time, item FL just wasn't one of the ones that he took a look at. Is that right?
I choose, from all those cases I've worked since he was here last, I choose that 20% at random.
Oh, you do?
And it is exactly the case that this case file was not, when he came over in October, of one of those that I chose.
Okay, so you choose the 20%.
I do.
And so you come here to this jury today, though, with no documentation of any sort that establishes Mr. Templin has ever reviewed your opinion about item FL.
I came here today with able to tell you that the procedure that we abide by requires, before this report is approved by a supervisor and allowed to leave the laboratory.
All right, Your Honor.
There has to have been.
He's not responsive.
A review by Reg Templin.
No, it's responsive.
Okay.
I'm going to allow it.
Go ahead.
There has to have been, before this report is allowed out of there, proof to the supervisor that this case has been reviewed, that this report and my conclusions have been reviewed by Reg Templin or someone else over in the Milwaukee laboratory, or this report doesn't get out. The fact that they even saw this report, anybody saw this report, is in fact proof that Reg saw my photographs, agreed with my conclusions, approved with the review process, acknowledged that those conclusions were correct in his mind, and the report then went out.
Okay, and that is your assumption because of the usual way in which reports get approved, right?
Well, it's not an assumption. It's what I know happened.
But you don't have any documentation in the file that confirms that, do you?
I do have documentation on the computer that could only have been created by him.
And you don't have it with you?
I do not. That's correct.
All right. Thank you. That's all I have.
Members of the jury, let's take a stretch break before we go back for redirect. Since this is going to be the last witness today, I'm not sending you out for an afternoon break. Mr. Fallon, any redirect?
Yes, just a couple of questions. Thank you, Judge. I'm going to ask my colleague to see if we can pull up exhibit. Well, before we do that, you indicated in cross-examination that there are class characteristics, subclass characteristics, and individual characteristics, as I understand it. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. With respect to item FK, I believe your testimony was there were general or class characteristics that were still present on item FK.
Yes.
Were there sufficient subclass features or sufficient individual characteristics that you might have been able to rely upon to attempt any identification or comparison?
On that item FK, your 276, there were simply not enough of those individual characteristics. I'm not concerned with subclass characteristics, particularly in this examination. There were not enough of the individual characteristics, some of those little markings that we saw in some of the photographs on that item, to allow me to come to any specific conclusion about the gun that fired that bullet.
All right. Now, I had a couple of questions. There we go. You were asked questions about item 426, groove impression number 1. And you used the words that between the test-fired bullet and the sample bullet, there were, I think you said, a great deal of difference. First of all, tell us what you mean by that.
Sure. Well, what we have to understand is there's always differences. The test-fired bullets, when I compare those, I expect to see differences. You cannot fire 2 bullets from any gun and expect to see what we have maybe heard referred to as a perfect match. Those simply just don't exist. What's critical is to be able to understand when the differences you see are, in fact, significant. Do I have to worry about this difference? What I think I described as cannelure, this set of markings, or this set of depressions that you see vertically over here? Clearly, that's a difference, a very obvious difference to everyone. Does it mean anything? It means absolutely nothing. That's a manufacturer's marking that's put on there, has nothing to do with the gun it was fired in. It's not obliterated by firing it through the barrel of the gun. I don't even care whether it's there or not. Clearly, it plays no role. That's an example of the difference. It plays no role, has no influence whatsoever in my evaluating those markings on the bullet to determine whether it was fired from a gun. Other differences. Differences in the color here. They may have started out the same color. Differences in color don't mean a thing. What I'm interested in, so long as all of the class characteristics are the same, what is absolutely required of me is that I recognize what markings we do have here that are individual, that have some significance because they relate to the manufacturing process that created the barrel from which this bullet was fired. I have to know that they are individual or unique to that particular barrel. That's not an issue in this case either. The other element of this is related to markings that from where you are sitting, I suspect you can't see. I know I can't see them clearly from here. They are in this area right here, and this is the only place in this photograph where I have individual detail that I'm trying to take a picture of to show you the kind of thing I'm seeing under the microscope. This isn't everything I saw under the microscope. This is just an example of what I saw. And I will tell you that in group impression number 1, that we have some correlation. We have some matching of stria in this location. And in fact, in this location, however, there is not enough stria there for identification. If this is all I had on this bullet, I would have had the same conclusion I had with the other bullet here, because that wouldn't be enough. Of course, it isn't all I had. With regard to this photograph, though, the usefulness of this area that I have labeled DI, number 1, was that it gave me a reference point. I have got all this stuff you see on these bullets. I need to be comparing different parts of the bullet, of one bullet to different parts of the other bullet. It's kind of nice to have a place to start. And there are a pair of stria there that I had observed on my first test fires, that when I got done looking at my test fires, I knew I was going to look for those on the bullet and, frankly, see if I got lucky. And they were on the bullet that was recovered in Exhibit 277. And the fact of the matter is, they were there. That's what this photograph exhibits. This is part of the process, but it is not the whole process. And this isn't everything that led me to the conclusion that this bullet here was fired from that Marlin rifle.
So that photograph is an example of what part of the overall analysis?
It's one element of the examination.
All right. Now, those markings, those stria that you were talking about, are those the things that occur during the manufacturing process that actually leaves and makes firearms and weapons identification possible?
These stria are a result of the manufacturing process.
All right, 1 second. Can you elaborate on that manufacturing process? I know you talked a little bit about it, but now that it's come up here on cross-examination and those markings, how are those markings, how did they assist you as the examiner in making that determination?
When I'm trying to determine whether a bullet was fired from a gun, it all starts with understanding what the manufacturer is doing to produce that barrel. There are unquestionably methods of creating barrels, putting grooves in barrels that will produce markings that reproduce from barrel to barrel. And clearly, if you can't recognize it, I can't recognize those when I'm looking at bullets. Then there's no way I can come to any conclusions about that. Any firearms examiner has to bring to the examination an understanding of how that gun barrel was made and what creates these markings we see on the bullets. With Marlin, I can tell you exactly how they made that barrel. And because I know what they did, what machining processes they did, or applied to that barrel to create the grooves in the barrel, I also know that the defects, those microscopic defects that were left in the barrel after that process was done, are going to create these markings on the bullet, and they are going to be unique to that barrel. So that's the first step in the process. And I say, looking at and having this gun in front of me, that what I'm looking at that's going to be created by the barrel of the gun is that unique to the gun. In this case, I can. The next step, any other thing that requires experience and training in the knowledge that a firearm examiner brings to an examination, is an awareness that when we have those markings, I may have 150 of these tiny little scratches and stria scattered around the surface of a bullet, and clearly some of them are going to line up. We expect that randomly. If I have 2 bullets that have been fired from separate guns, obviously some of these are going to line up. So there's got to be more than just finding lines that line up. And there is, of course. I have to be aware of, part of my background has to have looked at hundreds or probably thousands by now of non-matched situations where I'm looking at bullets that I know were not fired from the same gun, trying to force a match, but recognizing what kind of agreement am I going to see in a non-matched situation. And then demanding that when I look at something like this, that I have more than that to come to an identification. That is also critical for a firearms and tool mark examiner. And finally, we talked about consecutive matching stria a little bit. I didn't get into it in a lot of detail. When we look at our matching lines, there's a number of different ways to evaluate them. I think counsel brought up from, Mr. Biasotti's paper, that we might find as much as 38% lines matching on a comparison and on 2 bullets that we know were fired from the same gun. Is that significant? Can I look at 2 bullets, count all the lines, and see if I've got 38%? And if I have 40%, say, oh, those were fired from the same gun? Not at all. The percent matching is not a good criteria for judging whether a bullet was fired from the same gun. We don't use that. What we have found, and Mr. Biasotti's study that counsel quoted over there started this all up back in 1959. What we've been able to define and quantify, I can provide some numbers for you if you like, is what about matching lines is significant to the examiner when he's trying to make that conclusion.
If I can stop you there for a second, these matching lines, those were produced in the manufacturing process?
These are produced They are a result of defects in the barrel.
All right.
These defects create these stria, these lines, if you like, on the surface of the bullet or on the cartridge casings, as the case may be.
And that is what they used to make the identification.
Exactly. And if you could look more closely at this.
If I can interrupt you.
I'm sorry?
And ask you a couple of questions to conclude then. I think it's important that we make one point that may not be as abundantly obvious as it should be. But when you test fire a bullet in the laboratory, what are the conditions under which that bullet is test fired?
I want a bullet that has not been damaged. I want a bullet on which the only markings I see were created by the barrel of the gun from which I fired it. And to accomplish that in the laboratory, I fire it into water. I have this big old 9-foot by 2.5-foot by 4-foot deep water tank and a port on one end of it, and I fire the bullet into the water. If the water is sufficient to slow it down, it drops to the bottom, and then I recover it from the bottom of the tank. And I know then that I have a bullet that's only been marked by the barrel of the gun.
All right. Now, is that the way you normally receive a sample from the field?
Of course not, no.
And so that fact that there may appear to be differences, could it simply be the result of the quality of what is submitted from having been shot in less than ideal situations compared to what you are doing in the laboratory when you test fire the bullet?
Almost any bullet I have ever seen recovered from a criminal investigation has struck something. It has struck a shooting victim, it's struck a wall, it's passed through a wall, whatever the case may be. And as you can imagine, this is a lead bullet, even a copper jacketed bullet. They get damaged, broken up into pieces. The kind of damage we see on that bullet is just very, very common. And so I'm not concerned about those kinds of differences. They don't matter. What I'm concerned about is whether this detail, this individual characteristics, these stria, have they been obliterated or not by its passage through a wall or by its having struck a shooting victim. And of course, I determine that by examination under the microscope.
Nothing else.
Mr. Buting, anything else?
Yes. All right. It's the same exhibit, but what was the number? Do you have it in front of you?
Oh,
This is the groove impression.
I don't have them anymore.
It's 426, Counsel.
426 is up there. One thing I just want to make clear, because I don't know that it's clear on the record to the jury. These, what appear are lineal indentations or rows on these bullets are the lands, right?
The two you just pointed at are land impressions.
Okay, land impressions. And the general impressions that you get here, you're going to get on any rifle that has 16 grooves and lands with a right hand twist, right?
The characteristics of that, the width of those impressions, would be characteristic of what you would get from a 16 land and groove manufactured barrel.
Okay, so the similarities in this exhibit with these, on these two sides of having these rows or lands impressions, would be something that would be considered a class characteristic.
Exactly.
That would be common with any Marlin 60 or even the Jennings pistol manufacturer, right?
That's correct.
What your opinion is based on are these similar scratches or stria in the groove area, right?
In this particular case, they happen to be in the groove impression. That's correct.
Right. And in your redirect testimony, you said that on this photograph, really the only area that you demonstrated enough individual characteristics on this whole photograph is this central area right here, which would be just to the left of where it says GI number 1. Is that right?
Only in groove impression number 1 in this photograph.
In this photograph, correct? So it's your opinion, zoom in on that once. So in your opinion, those two halves are so similar in this instance that you're able to consider this as one of your features that makes this bullet unique to that rifle that was before you earlier?
No, that's not what I said.
Well, okay, let me ask it this way. Your opinion is that those two sides match.
Again, I would not use that term for this particular groove impression, no.
Well, this one you thought was so unique or so similar that it was a reference point, right?
It was similar enough to be a reference point, and that's why I took the photograph of it, yes.
Okay, and so we rely on your opinion then that both sides of this photograph in that area match.
Again, I would not say that. That's not my description of this.
Similar. What's the word you want to use?
What I would say is that in this area, I have this pair of stria that were easy to see and that I could look for and use as a reference point. I was also very clear that, in fact, there is not enough other stria, and 2 is not enough, to support the conclusion that we have an identification here. I had to rely on other detail that, some of which I tried to photograph in the other photographs.
None of which can be quantitated. You can't just look at that and say, quantitatively, these match. Instead, it depends on your subjective opinion to this jury that those two sides match, or I'm sorry, not match, similar enough to consider individual.
With regard to this groove impression, there is quantitatively not enough information to conclude an identification. That information, that more complete quantitative information, is present in other areas of the bullet.
But in each one of those instances, it is an eyeball subjective conclusion on your part about whether those are similar, those two stria are similar or not.
I have no other way of evaluating it other than looking at it through a microscope. That's correct.
All right. Thank you. That's all I have.
All right. Mr. Fallon.
Nothing.
Very well. The witness is excused. Members of the jury, that is going to conclude our session for today. I did notify the bus line that they should stop early today. Hopefully they are here already. If they aren't, they will be shortly. I will remind you again not to discuss the case amongst yourself or with anyone else, and not to be exposed to any news media accounts of the case. We'll see you at the normal time tomorrow morning. You may be seated. Counsel, are there any exhibits that either party wishes to address at this time?
I move in, I think, all of the exhibits that I have introduced, which is 420 through 428.
I believe 420 was the one that was mismarked and never really discussed. That was the worksheet on the cartridges, so I'm not sure it has any particular relevance. And in terms of the photograph, were they black and white copies? Well, all right. I suppose we might as well move them in. I was going to say the disc is much more representative. The CD-ROM has all 7 photographs that were brought for exemplary purposes and identified as groove impressions 1, 3, 6. So...
Sure, I have no objection to that. The black and white simply give us a frame of reference on the record from which one is which.
So, is somebody going to provide for the record a disc that identifies them by exhibit number they were given?
417.
We have that?
Yeah, 417.
Very well.
It doesn't identify each individual one's inside. When you open it up, it doesn't have exhibit numbers on it, but these black and white ones will correspond, I think, enough that you can figure it out.
Fair enough. What about the 420? The one that was...
I will withdraw 420. We didn't get into. It was mismarked, actually.
Withdraw or simply not offer it for admission. 2 different things. If you withdraw it, I'm going to give it back to you. Alright?
Yeah, let's take it back.
420 is withdrawn.
That's fine.
Are there any other exhibits that need action?
Do you want me to keep a copy of it, that it was marked, or doesn't it matter? Normally, when it's withdrawn, I always keep a copy of it.
Keep a copy.
I was just wondering if maybe tomorrow we could get together with the clerk and see if we can have an overall accounting, see where we are on the exhibit scorecard.
At the beginning of the day, or the end?
Probably at the end.
At the end? When the jury is gone? Alright, we'll do that. We'll see you tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Do you have 425 up there?
Yes, I'm going to make a copy of this one that's withdrawn, and then I will give it back to you.
Okay.